I would like to welcome you to Standard Theory. This is an introduction to the standard theory of psychology. This is a theory that aims to explain everything about human behavior. The theory describes something called the Standard Behavioral Index along with several other things. The Standard Behavioral Index is comprised of two main parts. One is the scale of impulse or the Z scale. The second is the scale of intelligence, or the R scale. In the following segments we will discuss some of the main ideas that the theory is based on. From there, we will talk about things that are much more specific. Among these are categories referred to as thinking types and communication types, which are important to the structures of each of the scales. We will begin by using a unilateral view, meaning that, for now, we will only discuss the things that happen when things go the way they are supposed to in a constructive sense. We will explore the scales from lowest energy to highest energy so that the structure and different aspects of the scales can be presented. In later segments, after the scales have been presented, we can use those scales to answer virtually every question about human behavior. When we look at them from different angles, we can answer questions that are not unilateral. We can answer questions that are abnormal or non-standard phenomenon related to human behavior. Before that, though, we will discuss a few of the ideas that standard theory uses to organize the phenomenon of observing human behavior. Then we can discuss the scales and the thinking types and the communication types of each. Here are the main ideas that provide the foundation for the standard theory of psychology. Number 1. The standard theory of psychology states that the behavior and the communication of humans are related. Behavior and communication influence one another. This happens in order to complete a process known as a cycle of communication. The idea of a cycle of communication refers to the requirement that a process has a discernible beginning and end with something in between. Theoretically, the amount of information processed in communication and behavior can work together in order to achieve a complete cycle of communication. With humans, a complete cycle of communication can be achieved through communication alone. This can also be achieved with behavior alone. Or, as the first idea states, communication and behavior can be used together in order to process any part of either the beginning, middle or end of a cycle in order to create a completed amount of communication. Number 2. The standard theory of psychology states that each complete cycle of communication uses a specific amount of information. That means that there is a required amount of stuff that has to be communicated in order for the brain and its related structures to understand that a cycle of communication has been completed. One complete cycle theoretically handles an amount of information that is favorable to the structures of the brain in a way that allows the information to be handled according to the physical properties of those structures and the networks used in the handling of such information. This is a specific, interval ratio unit of information. When using the R scale, this interval ratio unit can be referred to as a characteristic of communication or simply as a characteristic. The characteristic is the interval ratio unit of the R scale. On the Z scale, though, this interval ratio unit is referred to as a subtraction. On the Z scale, the unit of communication is a subtraction. Number 3. The standard theory of psychology states that these cycles of communication can be observed as constructive or destructive. The communication that people are capable of can tend towards certain directions. For example, the communication or behavior that a person displays can tend towards a greater understanding or greater transmission of information. This is considered constructive communication. Another tendency is to tend towards a smaller amount of information being shared or communicated. That type of communication can be considered to be destructive. There are more complicated combinations of these tendencies, but, for the most part, the overall result of the communication and/or behavior can be considered either constructive or destructive. Number 4. Standard theory states that the goal of all behavior and communication is to experience psychological or neurological activation in a way that can be communicated with others. Theoretically, the only reason that humans communicate or behave in regard to one another is to display some level of neurological or psychological activity. The achievement of that activation would be the fundamental process being communicated and, inversely, that activation would be the process that would lead to some sort of observed behavior. Number 5. The standard theory of psychology states that the disruption of these processes will lead to some amount of compensation. When communication is disrupted, behavior will be used to complete the cycle of communication. When behavior is disrupted, communication will be used to complete the cycle of behavior. Furthermore, any time that either communication or behavior is interrupted, there is a chance that the cycle of communication can be left incomplete. When a person does not have the means to complete these disrupted communication cycles, a process referred to as derangement can occur. Repeated cycles of disruption or derangement can lead to a preference or habit of experiencing communication that is associated with an irregular amount of information. The repeated attempt to fix, reference or deal with a disruption or derangement can possibly lead to an unresolved cycle of communication. This is referred to as cyclic thinking and can be considered the fundamental process which contributes to mental illness. Number 6. The standard theory of psychology identifies a limit on psychological processing. In intelligence, the limit of this process is a person's individual intimate orientation or their own personal understanding of the world around them, as well as the meaning associated with their unique experiences of the world. This limit is required to be a person's one-on-one understanding of the world without respect to the environment, new situations or relationships, or outside influence. This requires a maximum amount of psychological activation and is the limit of intelligence. To review, there have been 6 ideas of standard theory presented here. Number 1. Behavior and communication work together to complete a communication cycle. Number 2. There is a specific amount of information in each communication cycle referred to as a characteristic or a subtraction. Number 3. Communication and behavior can be either constructive or destructive. Number 4. The goal of all behavior and communication is to transmit the amount of psychological activation being experienced. Number 5. A cycle of communication can be disrupted and, if not fixed, can lead to problems such as mental illness. Number 6. There is a limit to the communication that people can experience. In intelligence, this limit is referred to as an intimate orientation. Those main ideas contribute to the dynamics of the Standard Behavioral Index as well as the theory associated with it. Once we have those, we can begin learning about the different parts of the index and 2 of the main scales. The 2 main scales used to describe human behavior are the R scale and the Z scale. Within each of the scales there are categories known as thinking types. Within each thinking type is a communication type. Within that are the specific characteristics and subtractions that people use. These individual units of characteristics and subtractions are organized based on the amount of information that is associated with each level of activation. Each communication type contains a few units of communication. Each thinking type contains a few communication types. The Standard Behavioral Index separates most communication and behavior into one of the 2 scales. From there, the amount of information in that cycle of communication is organized by thinking type. From there, the process is sorted based on the communication type. Finally, a specific characteristic or subtraction can be identified. This process of narrowing down the possibilities of a person's processing allows us to definitively and objectively relate the communication cycle to a specific level of psychological activation. With that, we can attribute their behavior to a specific amount of activation or, namely, to a specific characteristic of communication. Next, we will discuss the scales beginning with the Z scale and a simplified version of vertical thinking. Once we understand that, we can move on to intelligent human behavior. Intelligent human behavior has some very specific requirements. We will not discuss those for now. Instead, we will focus on the simplified version of vertical thinking on the Z scale and then move on to each step of the scale of intelligence. Please join me in the next segment to discuss vertical thinking and subtractions. Welcome to Standard Theory. The previous segment presented 6 main ideas about the standard theory of psychology. This segment is a discussion about vertical thinking. The standard theory of psychology describes something called the Standard Behavioral Index. This index describes the 2 main scales related to human behavior. One of those scales is the scale of impulse, or the Z scale. The Z scale measures and organizes processes referred to as vertical thinking. These processes apply to virtually any living organism capable of interpreting sensory information in order to be aware of and recognize an environment. Once an organism is exposed to information from its environment, whether light, sound, vibration, heat or otherwise, the processing of that information can be accounted for based on the Z0 or Z0 scale. The Z0 scale is a scale of impulse. However, the processes described here are related to as the scale of pre-intelligent impulse. Standard theory separates the phenomenon organized by the Z0 scale into 3 discrete processes. These are the processes that correlate to the human's awareness and experience of the environment. These processes are referred to as impulse, subtraction and compression. The amount of information in each of these steps collectively contribute to one complete cycle of communication. For now, we can relate these processes to the experiences of humans. However, describing other animals, birds, bees, cats, dogs, are also possible. The first step of this process is referred to as impulse. In general, humans exist in some sort of environment. In that environment, a human will be exposed to information. The information as well as the sensory organs that a human can use to experience may vary. However, the exposure to that information allows the human to experience or recognize something about that environment. According to standard theory, the exposure to this information will lead to the organism's sensory capacities to be excited or stimulated in some way. From there, these sensory stimulations from the environment can build up to a critical point. At this critical point, the amount of information from the environment will lead to the process of impulse. Theoretically, the process of impulse alerts the human that the information from the environment has reached a level which could affect the human's survival. This is achieved by comparing the activity or wakefulness of the baseline processes in the brain with the activity of the environment. If that environmental factor exceeds that baseline amount of wakefulness, the process of impulse can occur. During this step, the human will experience the impulse as some sort of internal change. In humans, this can be related to either the fight or flight response, action potential of the brain and neurons and nervous system, or some other instinct or primal response. From there, the second step, referred to as subtraction, can occur. In the first step, some amount of information has caused the process of impulse to occur. The subtraction is the pattern of information from the environment that has triggered the impulse. The information related to the subtraction exists both in the environment and as a pattern within or between the sensory organs of the human. The subtraction is essentially the packet of information that has been experienced by the organism in a way that exists within the organism and in the environment. During the subtraction, that information packet is compared to the background process of the brain. The brain will determine if the information packet is different enough from any previous experience or contains enough information overall. If not, the cycle of communication will not continue. If the information is meaningful enough, the cycle will continue to the third step and the process referred to as compression can finally occur. In compression, the structures of the organism will save the subtraction that caused the impulse. This is the process that gives unique meaning to a specific set of information in the environment. The compression will keep a copy of the subtraction within the brain even after the human leaves the environment or after the environment has changed. The compression is meant to preserve the information which led to the critical point impulse without having to constantly expend energy on re-experiencing that potential threat and re-experiencing that impulse. This cycle of impulse, subtraction and compression as a complete cycle is referred to as vertical thinking. This describes the way that humans learn from their environment. The copies of their experience, or the compressions, become stored within the structures of the brain as a low-energy version of the information from those experiences. This low-energy status allows the storage of information that is obtained by experiencing information from an environment. By doing this repeatedly, the amount of energy used to experience those aspects of the environment is lowered overall. Once a completed compression is obtained, that compression theoretically becomes part of the background of the human's overall awareness or as a part of their wakefulness. This wakefulness is comprised of the familiar information that has already been learned and compressed in a low-energy state. There is a chance that this process of impulse, subtraction and compression can be disrupted or deranged, meaning that the experience either does not cycle to completion or fails in some way. This type of process leads to a non-standard or irregular amount of information being experienced or processed. We will not discuss the effects of that for now. We will continue to focus on the processes related to complete cycles of communication in a unilateral sense. According to standard theory, each completed cycle of communication contains a specific, interval ratio amount of information. In vertical thinking, that amount of information is referred to as a subtraction. A subtraction can be referred to as a low-energy process since the purpose is to store patterns of information related to experience in an inverted or low-energy format. The human brain has the potential to experience very specific subtractions which can lead to the activation of the newer, higher energy or intelligent areas of the brain. These areas of the brain differ from the areas associated with vertical thinking. In vertical thinking, the processes of the associated structures are meant to conserve energy by converting information from the environment into a low-energy compression. In intelligence, though, the purpose is to convert these low-energy processes into high-energy processes in order to combine and create new associations which are comprised of multiple low-energy processes. This process of combining low-energy experiences into high-energy experiences is the fundamental process of intelligence, which we will discuss next. Please join me in the next segment to discuss horizontal thinking and intelligence. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment we discussed vertical thinking and subtractions. In this segment we will discuss the beginnings of horizontal thinking and intelligence. The experience of vertical thinking, impulse and subtractions on the Z scale is meant to create low energy or inverted versions of experience. In horizontal thinking and intelligence on the R scale, the purpose is to combine those low energy subtractions by converting them into high energy thoughts and, from there, obtaining unique, high-energy patterns of intelligent experience. The Z0 scale does not necessarily keep track of the communication cycles individually, as each cycle will change with respect to the environment being experienced by the human at any given time. When using the R scale, though, there is the idea that each of the high-energy processes are comprised of a specific amount of interval ratio information. Each of these intelligent ideas activates a specific amount of neurological or psychological processing with the same interval ratio unit. For this reason, the variability of the processes is dependent only on the subtractions that lead to the formation of the new, intelligent idea. In general, there are a certain number of processes occurring in the brain at any given time. The brain will use some method of comparison to determine whether there is more or less resources compared to a baseline number of processes occurring. In intelligence, the determination that an excess number of processes being available is a requirement. From there, the brain will use these excess resources to create a new, unique idea. This specific amount of information is referred to as a characteristic. The general process of combining low-energy subtractions into high-energy characteristics is referred to as intelligence. Intelligence is measured using the R scale. Each time the brain measures an excess amount of resource, the brain is able to combine an additional set of subtractions into a characteristic. The subtractions that the brain compares subsequently should also exist in an interval ratio unit. With each additional amount of excess resource, the brain has the capacity to experience an additional characteristic. In this case, the brain would be using that excess resource to process the first characteristic and then the second characteristic, then the third, and so on. Again, this depends on whether or not the brain perceives the amount of excess energy to be adequate enough to complete this process. According to standard theory, there is a specific ratio of times that the brain is able to perform this process of creating high-energy characteristics. The R scale measures this capacity by organizing characteristics from 1 to 117. The R scale also organizes the capacity of each of these using thinking types and communication types. The thinking type is determined by the number or magnitude of total activation the characteristics being experienced. There are 3 thinking types described by the R scale. Horizontal thinking deals with characteristics 1 through 9. Orthogonal thinking deals with characteristics 10 through 17. Absolute thinking deals with characteristics 27 through 117. Each thinking type contains a communication type, which describes the specific characteristics contained within. The communication types in horizontal thinking are silent, intimate, and social communication. In orthogonal thinking, the communication type is shared communicating. In absolute thinking, the communication type is supersocial communication. Please join me in the next segment as we discuss more about horizontal thinking. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment we discussed the process of intelligence and the beginnings of horizontal thinking. So far, we have discussed some main ideas of the standard theory of psychology, the Z0 scale and subtractions, and most recently the beginnings of the R scale and intelligence. In this segment we will discuss the specific processes of horizontal thinking on the R scale. We will begin to discuss each characteristic specifically, beginning with the first characteristic of communication. The first characteristic of communication is referred to as self-identification. This is part of silent communication, which is part of horizontal thinking. So, to clarify where this information is organized on the R scale, we will reiterate that the first characteristic of communication is part of the scale of intelligence in horizontal thinking within silent communication. Silent communication in general contains 3 characteristics. The first characteristic is the display of identity. The second characteristic is the display of interaction. The third characteristic is the display of orientation. Each of these 3 steps relates to a specific amount of psychological activation in intelligence. In order to describe each of the characteristics, we will explain the associated requirements and observable aspects related to each respective level of activation. In the first characteristic of self-identification, a person must first obtain excess resources as well as the low-energy subtractions required to create a high-energy intelligent process. This process is a cycle of communication within the individual and between the individual and no one else. In order for this cycle of communication to be completed, the individual must disregard the environment, other people and other relationships as well as other external factors. This allows the cycle of communication to become truly intelligent as the factors of the environment and the psychological processing of others is no longer regarded and is no longer part of the self-identification process. By disregarding these external factors, the individual can create a unique version of events that correlate to the intelligent experience of self. This process can be difficult to achieve based on extraneous factors such as overcrowding, relationships with family, friends, co-workers or other individuals, the availability of excess nutrient or resources, the need for survival and the inherent survival response, and also society in terms of mass media and social connectedness. Once a person is able to experience some adequate amount of self-identification, that person should come to terms with some aspects of physical reality such as the physical requirements for survival and so on. A general way to ask oneself whether or not an idea is truly a self-identifiable process is to determine the origins of the subtractions of the idea. For example, a person might tell themselves that they like the color blue. The color blue in this case could be in the environment around them. The people around them could be wearing blue, the decor of the room might be the color blue. They might be cheering for a sports team wearing the color blue. Each of these reasons on their own are valid. However, if a person were to leave those situations for another environment which does not necessarily contain those color, the person could tell themselves again that they like the color blue. However, if that seems unrelated or untrue since there would be no decor or other people or other sports team, the person's idea that they like the color blue could be interpreted as a product of the environment rather than a truly internalized decision. If that statement was still true, even if the situation and environment may have changed, then the process could more than likely be considered a self-identifiable process. This is considered the lowest threshold of true intelligence. There are other processes in intelligence which correlate to a person's interpretations of these factors with respect to other relationships and the interpretation of the environment. These processes are considered a different thinking type since the interpretation requires some amount of environmental process combined with an intelligent process. The express requirement that the subtractions have been previously experienced and compressed are a major aspect of horizontal thinking. The experience of the first characteristic can be considered one of the most difficult to achieve consistently, as its requirements as an event separate from an environment, as well as the need for additional resource needing to be achieved repeatedly in a way that leads to the preference of this type of communication. Since there is a specific amount of information associated with these, though, standard theory could be used to count the intrinsic number of times that this would need to be achieved in order for that to happen. With enough of these self-identification processes, the second characteristic can be reached. The second characteristic of communication is referred to as self-interaction. This process is responsible for attaining the excess resources needed in order to experience continued high-energy activation. In a more general sense, though, the second characteristic or self-interaction is determined by the intelligent consideration of overall body status. Any process which influences the overall status of the body is considered in self-interaction. This includes any amount of signaling process in the body: diet, exercise, sleep, grooming, the need for food or shelter, medication, substances, and so on. Anything that affects the overall status of the body is important in the experience of self-interaction. Until an adequately excess amount of resource has been determined, the continued activation of intelligence will not be able to continue. Functionally, in order to achieve a higher level of activation than the two characteristic, the self-interaction experience must be enough to remove or satisfy the inhibitory processes in the brain. The role and function of those processes are more thoroughly discussed in other areas such as neurochemistry, as this process is largely related to the neurotransmitters in the brain responsible for signaling things such as stress and hunger, muscle function, and so forth. The adequate satisfaction of these responses allows the body to release priority of the available resources to the brain rather than conserve those resources for survival specifically. The removal of these inhibitory responses theoretically allows the brain to use any excess resources for the purpose of continued higher energy activation. Also, in theory, the purpose of making this exclusion is to obtain new experiences and environmental understanding without being forced to experience a survival response. By circumventing or avoiding the survival response, the person would be able to make decisions that lead to a situation more viable to survival without the need for continued impulse. The need for survival may still influence the decision-making process in terms of obtaining the things needed for survival. However, one goal of those intelligent processes is to do so without the inherent need for the survival impulse. At some point, an adequate amount of self-interaction will lead to the satisfaction of the inhibitory responses. Once this happens, the brain marks that even by releasing those inhibitory molecules from their receptors. This is similar to removing a lock from a gate or opening the pathway to higher activation and energy consumption. That inverse response of inhibition removal is theoretically the process associated with the third characteristic or self-orientation. In self-orientation, the phenomenon of removing those inhibitions becomes associated with the self-interaction that led to the removal of inhibition. For example, understanding that sleeping for some time makes you less tired, that drinking leads to being less thirsty, or that eating leads to being less hungry. These processes differ from impulse in certain ways, namely that the concept of thirst or hunger drives the process rather than the biological or physical experience of the process. In impulse, A person would first feel hungry and then try to do something about it. In intelligence, a person would recognize that, at some point, they might feel hungry, so they choose to eat before the feeling of hunger comes to them. Similarly, in intelligence, a person might be able to recognize and understand their own hunger and choose not to do anything about it, while, in impulse, a person would continue to experience that hunger until something in the environment allowed it to change. The understanding of the consequence of a self-interaction leads to self-understanding. From there, a person can use their silent intelligence to make decisions based on those factors. Upon gaining self-understanding, though, a person also gains the capacity for free will. We will not spend much time about the true discussion regarding free will here. Instead, we will consider the things that we can do with self-understanding. Once we have gained the capacity for self-identification, self-interaction and self-understanding, we can use self-understanding in order to do one of two things. One would be to continue increasing intelligent experience and then expend energy on communicating that experience to others, or two, to continue some amount of self-interaction or self-identification and expend energy on communicating with the self. This junction is referred to as the free will junction. Here, an individual can choose whether to direct energy expenditure on the self or to direct energy expenditure for the sake of others. We will not discuss the lowering of energy activation for now. If one chooses to increase the expenditure of energy on others, their increased activation will lead them to the next communication type, referred to as intimate communication. Please join me in the next segment where we'll discuss intimate communication in horizontal thinking. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment, we introduced silent communication, which is part of horizontal thinking on the scale of intelligence, or the R scale. In this segment, we will discuss another type of communication within horizontal thinking. The communication type that we will discuss is referred to as intimate communication. In the previous segments, we talked about impulse, which refers to recognizing an environment. Then we discussed silent communication, which deals with using those experiences to create unique high-energy responses without regard to the environment or other people. Intimate communication is a somewhat more dynamic set of process, as they are meant to be experienced between two individuals. That is, exactly one individual with exactly one other individual. There is the requirement that each of the individuals obtain the appropriate and necessary level of psychological activation in order for this to occur. The requirement that each individual has obtained sufficient silent communication to the point of choosing to advance to intimate communication is marked by the fourth characteristic of communication. This characteristic is referred to as the intimate interaction. This is the understanding that an individual has obtained enough self-interaction and self-understanding to prioritize increasing psychological activation in a way that allows that level of activation to be communicated to exactly one other individual. In intimate communication, each of the individuals must be able to secure this level of activation prior to communicating in a constructive sense. Otherwise, the level of psychological activation would not be adequate to facilitate the higher order, high-energy functioning experienced in intimate communication. As mentioned in a previous segment, the purpose or goal of all psychological activation and communication is to communicate the experience of that activation with others. In intimacy, the interpretation and communication of that experience is a dynamic process. This process involves exchanging or reciprocating the levels of psychological activation associated with these levels of processing. These are referred to as the fifth and sixth characteristics of communication. The fifth characteristic is referred to as intimate identity. The sixth characteristic is referred to as intimate orientation. The intimate orientation can be considered to be the maximum psychological activation that a person can experience intelligently. The standard theory of psychology reinforces this explanation in a few different ways using math and geometry, but that will not be discussed here. The amount of activation being processed in the sixth characteristic, though, will lead to a sort of overload event in the brain. In this event, the level of activation exceeds the threshold of the brain's structures. This overload, according to standard theory, will be marked by the release or transmission of a neurotransmitter, namely dopamine or oxytocin. The release of these chemicals becomes associated with the overload response of the sixth characteristic. From there, the interpretation of that event will be determined by the fifth characteristic, or intimate identity. The intimate identity is related to whether or not that overload event was marked by a physical release of a neurotransmitter. In intimate identity, there is a chance that the overload event was not associated with physical neurotransmitter release. There are several reasons that this might happen, such as an overload event that happens out of order or in a way that does not follow lowest to highest activation. The lack of release during overload can be associated with lack of resource or lack of availability of neurotransmitter in the brain. This can also be caused by medication, toxins, chemicals, environmental factors among other things. Furthermore, the release of neurotransmitter or other molecules might occur without an overload event, especially in medication and substance abuse. For these reasons, the overload event and the interpretation of the overload event are seen as separate characteristics, the sixth characteristic referring to the set of events that are associated with the overload event and the fifth characteristic referring to the result or interpretation of that event. The sum of positive and negative interpretations of these processes is likened to the personality of a person. According to standard theory, the personality is related to the interpretations of overload situations based on whether or not there was an associated release of transmitter. The sixth characteristic is related to an overall, maximum understanding of the entirety of intelligence and the sum of meaningful experiences in relation to real-time, new experience. The fifth characteristic, or personality, is related to the outcome of each of those events. In constructive intimacy, both individuals will experience their individual orientations or ability to communicate. From there, one individual will experience either a new overload event known as a sixth characteristic or will communicate the result of a previous overload event, known as a fifth characteristic. From there, the other person will reciprocate that process by returning a result from the other person's overload event or by experiencing an overload event related to the other person's previous response. This exchange of intimate identity and intimate orientation between exactly two individuals is the goal of all psychological communication. This process will continue for a limited amount of time, though, as, eventually, something will disrupt this process. A physical response, an environmental factor or the lack of an identity or orientation will lead to the breakdown of this reciprocation cycle. Furthermore, there are only a specific number of times that the brain can process this type of communication. From there, some amount of deactivation will have to occur, which we will not discuss now. Instead, we will explore the third communication within horizontal thinking. Please join me in the next segment to discuss social communication. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment we discussed intimate communication in horizontal thinking. In this segment we will discuss another type of communication in horizontal thinking known as social communication. In the previous segments, we discussed both intimate and silent communication. The pattern seen in those types of communication trended from a lower level of activation and moved to a higher, maximum amount of information. Social communication can be considered an inverted version of the other types of horizontal communication. This can be considered since the trend of social communication is to begin with the maximum amount of awareness that one has achieved in terms of previous compression and, from there, trend toward an increasingly more specific aspect of those processes. Also, the experience of silent communication began with securing a self-identity which disregards the external environment for favor of internal processing. Social communication, though, begins with the separation from individuality. The maximum or associated amount of separation from individuality is referred to as a social identity. Another point to be made is the trend of the numbering of characteristics. In silent and intimate communication, the trends began and the first characteristic and increased to the second, third and so on. In social communication, though, the separation of individuality is considered to be the maximum increase of separation from individuality. For that reason, the numbering social communication begins at the ninth characteristic and proceeds to the eighth and seventh characteristics. This gives the overall trend of horizontal thinking to be described as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 8, 7 when considering stepwise activation. In the ninth characteristic there is a specific amount of information that has been experienced by a person. This is directly related to the number of vertical subtractions that a person has experienced. As mentioned previously, intelligence is defined by the high-energy combinations of these subtractions. In social communication, during the separation of individuality, the process of social communication correlates to accessing every subtraction at once rather than choosing a specific subtraction to compose with one another. This can be thought to be handled by the frontal lobe, where the platform for high-energy comparison can be handled without the need to choose any specific compression. The separation from self-identity occurs once all of the subtractions that a person is capable of are considered. The total amount of all of these subtractions is the measure of separation from individuality or as a measure of social identity. According to standard theory, the measure of social identity depends on the experiences of the individual. Any given individual could theoretically consider several factors of reality within their social identity, including ideas about light and matter, the fabric of space-time, the extent of the universe and so forth. For another individual, the separation of individuality might contain some ideas about the earth and moon and stars. For another, that separation might be the sky and earth only. For others, the idea of a country or state or city. And moreover, the separation may not extend from the physical reality of that person themselves. The measure of the separation of individuality gives a magnitude of social identity. This is much more important in other thinking types, but we will not discuss that now. Within the separation of individuality or within the social identity there can be subsets of information. That is, the understanding of smaller ratios of information within the bigger picture. These smaller subsets are referred to as the social orientation or as the eighth characteristic. These subsets are easily understood as items, ideas, abstracts or set of information that is observable by any other person with an adequate social identity to do so. That requirement also refers to the idea that the subset of information must be observable by another person in order to be considered a true social construct or true social orientation. If the abstract, idea or object is not able to be experienced by another with an adequate capacity, that thing cannot be considered a true social orientation and is, instead, explained by a different thinking type. For now, we have presented to social identity and the social orientation. The third process in social communication is referred to as the social interaction or as the seventh characteristic. At this point, we have described two main processes. One of those processes is related to subtraction, or a process measured by the scale of impulse. The second is a process related to a characteristic, or a process on the scale of intelligence. These high-energy processes and low-energy processes can be applied to the social orientation in order to result in a social interaction. The consideration of a social orientation, whether that is idea, item or otherwise, can be interpreted by any person who has the capacity to do so. Functionally, the person experiencing the social orientation or item will assign some sort of meaning to the item in order to complete the cycle of communication. This leads to the item being associated with either a high-energy or low-energy process. This is a somewhat inverted version of the process of constructive intimacy where an overload event leads to the interpretation of the circumstance. In social communication, a subset of information is interpreted to have intrinsic meaning based on the presentation of that item within the separation of individuality. If the item is interpreted to be meaningful, there is a chance that the social identity will be associated with a high-energy process within that separation of individuality. If there is not enough meaning associated with that item, there is a chance that the item will be associated with a low-energy process or either have its meaning refuted. The association of high or low-energy processes in social interaction relies on a specific set of factors including the intelligent personality of the individual interpreting these things, the item itself as well as the separation of individuality in which that item is presented. In any sense, though, the pattern of social communication will trend from a large view of some set of information to subset of information and, from there, an interpretation of that subset in a high or low-energy association. This process can repeat a specific ratio of times similarly to the other processes in intelligence. However, these processes do not necessarily require that the activation follow a path leading to a maximum activation. For that reason, there is the likelihood that an individual could theoretically relate a larger number of social interactions than they would any other type of horizontal thinking such as intimate orientation or self-interaction. Because of this, there is also the chance that the interpretation of self-interaction as well as other types of social communication can replace and influence other versions of communication. We will not discuss that at this point. So far we have discussed horizontal thinking and all three its communication types. Please join me in the next segment where we continue exploring the R scale with orthogonal thinking and shared communication. Welcome to Standard Theory. So far we have covered the Z0 scale and the beginning of the R scale in horizontal thinking. In this segment we will continue exploring the R scale in orthogonal thinking. Orthogonal thinking refers to an indirect type of communication. Vertical thinking essentially refers to communication between one and the environment. Silent communication refers to one to self. Intimate communication refers to one-on-one. Social communication refers to one to many. Shared communication can be thought of as many-to-one or an indirect one-on-one communication. The dynamics of shared communication can vary, but the primary aspect determined by the roles of the parties of communication. The parties communicating can be considered to be communicating using either low or high energy or some combination of the two. For this reason, the parties considered are referred to as either aversive or subversive. The terms aversive and subversive refer to the type of identity being used to communicate. The identity of the aversive party is usually already decided or is being considered separately from the self-identity. The identity of the subversive part usually has not been decided or is being considered based on the thoughts or actions of the aversive party. The processes leading to the assumption of either of these roles can vary, and, if not performed voluntarily, can lead to some problems with the dynamic of shared communication. That will not be discussed at this point, though. However, within shared communication, further specification of the handling of the information can be determined. To begin to explain this indirect dynamic, we can begin with the subversive and aversive party. Previously, had it discussed characteristic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 8, 7, or 1 through 9. In orthogonal thinking, each person will utilize an indirect activation of one or more of those individual characteristics without necessarily following the lowest to highest activation seen in horizontal thinking. The combination or composition of these individual characteristics will range from characteristics 10 through 17. These characteristics are measured on the R scale within orthogonal thinking in shared communication. We can describe this indirect dynamic by consider the activation of each of these characteristics from each side of the communication cycle. For these examples, we will assume that the aversive party has successfully separated themselves from their own individuality in order to facilitate some type of indirect communication with the subversive party. The subversive party will first consider the thought process or action of the aversive party and, from there, will try to form their own idea about one of the characteristics. In this example, we will assume that the aversive party has interpreted something related to their separation of individuality that relates to the subversive party. The subversive will consider that information and from there, disregard the aversive party in order to draw their own intelligent conclusion about the information from the aversive party. To get even more specific, we can follow the composition of these two processes by relating their specific characteristics to an indirect version of a communication cycle. In this example, we will assume again that the aversive party is communicating something about their social identity. Using that, we can consider a 9 characteristic. Since this is an indirect type of communication, we can use a plus sign in order to denote the idea that a single, specific characteristic is being communicated outside of a normal communication cycle. From there we get 9 and a plus sign. The subversive party can consider that composed 9 characteristic and determine which specific characteristic is influenced the most based on that composition. This theoretically requires some amount of observation or communication with the subversive party, but for this example we can assume that the subversive party associates the 9 composition with a self-interaction or a 2 characteristic or 9 plus 2. This gives a composition of the aversive 9 characteristic with the subversive 2 characteristic, leading to a cycle characteristic of 11. This characteristic is within the constructive range of 10 through 17. With a few more steps, we can decompose this cycle characteristics to its subversive and aversive components. This requires a bit more theory, but for now, when decomposing, we will always assume that the cycle was truly constructive. For that reason, we will decompose our characteristic of 11 using a factor of information related to 1,9 characteristic. That decomposition would be the cycle characteristic of 11 minus the cycle characteristic of 9, which results in a cycle characteristic of 2. From this, we can assume that whatever information that the aversive party has shared has influenced the subversive party's understanding of their own self-interaction. As mentioned, this can be further specified using the R scale. This experience of this specific cycle characteristic of 11 can be referred to as a shared self-interaction. Similarly, in a constructive sense, a person involved in shared communication can experience other shared versions of intelligence such as shared social orientation, shared intimate identity, and so forth. In order to give each of the cycle characteristics a true name, we would have to assume that the cycles leading to those characteristics would always be constructive in a specific way. However, in reality, we might not always be able to do that. For that reason, among others, each characteristic in orthogonal thinking can be referred to based on the cycle characteristic related to the indirect communication cycle. From there, if more clarification is needed, the cycle can be decomposed according to the observations and information known about the cycle. Without that, the assumption might be a valid argument but might be neither accurate nor concise. Orthogonal thinking is a dynamic process but is also indirect. Furthermore, the experience of orthogonal thinking is somewhat favorable over other types of intelligence, especially over horizontal thinking, as the amount of energy required to experience these levels of activation in horizontal thinking is shared between the parties participated in orthogonal thinking rather than the entire amount of information being processed by each individual separately as in horizontal thinking. For this reason, the favorability of the indirect method of communication offered by orthogonal thinking can lead to some disproportionate and destructive outcomes based solely on the need to conserve energy, which makes the intelligent process of shared communication easily confusable with the process of impulse in vertical thinking. That will be discussed sometime later. In this segment we introduce the indirect dynamic of composition, cycle characteristics and decomposition in shared communication in orthogonal thinking on the R scale. These characteristics range from 10 to 17 and contain an aversive and subversive aspect. Please join me in the next segment where we will continue exploring the R scale through absolute thinking and supersocial communication. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment we discussed the indirect dynamic of orthogonal thinking and shared communication. In this segment we will continue to explore intelligence on the R scale with absolute thinking and supersocial communication. In the previous segments we discussed characteristics 1 through 17. Each of those are somewhat closely related and follow a general pattern of increasing activation. Each of those thinking types have their own dynamic to account for the processing associated with those characteristics. In absolute thinking, though, the dynamic changes somewhat. Before, the characteristics were either experienced in a stepwise activation or the activation was shared indirectly between communicating parties. In absolute thinking, the amount of activation being processed actually exceeds the threshold of activation that the brain is able to handle at any given point. This leads to a problem when orienting the brain to the nature of the information as well as how to store and recall that information. As mentioned previously, each communication cycle should contain a discernible beginning, middle and end. Before, we were able to solve that problem based on the stepwise activation of each or the shared activation of each. In absolute thinking, though, there is a chance that all three, beginning, middle and end, are presented and on top of that are not discernible from one another. For this reason, the brain has to perform an additional sorting process prior to comparing the activations being considered. This additional process of sorting is one of the main features of absolute thinking. In addition, these sorting processes are referred to as nodes of communication and are comprised of a specific amount of cycle characteristics. In absolute thinking, those nodes are at 27, 54 and 117 cycle characteristics of communication. To begin with, we will consider the simplest form of absolute thinking in supersocial communication. We will refer to the process of composition which was discussed in a previous segment in order to address this. Using composition, we can consider the amounts of information that lead to the overactivation of the intelligent areas of the brain. This example refers to the process of constructive intimacy being interrupted by another person. In this sense, the characteristics being experienced by the three individuals would be noted as 6 plus 9 plus 9 plus 1, or as 6 plus 9 plus 10. This refers to one person who has maxed out their intelligent activation, one person who has become separated from their identity along with a second person who has become separated from their identity and, from there, the consideration of either of the parties on how to compose their own identity with respect to the communication cycle. This is a total of at least 3 identities being communicated at one time with a cycle characteristic of 25. This leads to too much information being processed as well as the beginning, middle and end of the process being unresolved in a way which leads to an incomplete cycle for each party. For this reason, an additional level of sorting is required prior to considering how to complete the communication. This is the simplest case of supersocial thinking and is referred to as three-party shared intimacy. As discussed previously, the options for solving this sorting problem can be considered using nodes of communication and sorted using one of two processes, either an intelligent, high-energy process or an impulsive, low-energy process. In supersocial communication, these sorting processes are referred to as directives and deferrals. This allows the information to be sorted in some way prior to completing the cycle of communication. A directive refers to an intelligent process while a deferral is related to an impulsive process. After applying one of those processes, the continued evaluation of those levels of psychological activations can continue. To begin with, the easiest way to truly resolve these problems is to reduce the amount of consideration being handled at once. So, for that reason, the default process could be considered to be a deferral of the additional identity. From there, another version of intelligent communication, whether shared, social, silent or intimate, can be used to solve the cycle of communication. This leads to one of the identities being considered as part of a different communication cycle. This allows the remaining 2 identities to be considered using a different type of communication while the deferral can either be resolved as no meaning or otherwise composed in a separate cycle of communication. The consideration of these identities only outside of three-party shared intimacy is referred to as the first step in supersocial communication. This first step of comparing 3 or more identities is referred to as the supersocial identity. The deferral of at least one of these identities can lead to moving to a different thinking type since the amount of information being compared can change. The other option, though, is to consider all 3 identities in a way that compares them using more information. This first directive increases the amount of psychological activation in a way that forces the brain to compare the magnitude of each of the three identities along with the perceived change in the identities or their influence on the overall comparison. This leads to the second step of supersocial activation. This second step of comparing three identities and the influence of those identities is referred to as a supersocial interaction. At this point, all three identities as well as their associated changes can be considered. The default action from there would be to defer at least one of those influences as different from the other two. That would lead to a change in activation back to the supersocial identity where the three identities can be re-evaluated and, subsequently, the identity with deferred interaction would also be deferred, resulting in a different communication type being used to solve that problem. The other option in supersocial interaction would be to compare each of the identities as well as each of the interactions by using more information. This would lead to the third step of supersocial communication, which is referred to as supersocial orientation. In a previous segment we discussed the overload event of horizontal thinking in intimate communication, specifically intimate orientation. That type of overload event is normally associated with neurotransmitter release. In supersocial communication and specifically supersocial orientation, a similar scenario is observed. Because of the capacity to store the information related to these processes, the brain experiences an overload event when trying to solve which part of the communication is which as well as where to store the associated information. According to standard theory, this overload event will lead to a physiological response. This physiological response is the result of this overload process and is regulated by the nervous system and likely the vagus nerve. This overload leads to the experience of a startle-like response referred to as eplexia. This startle response is related to survival and meant to conserve resources during times of threat or extreme stress. In theory, the amount of information being processed as well as the level of psychological activation required to achieve this exceeds the available amount of resource that the brain has at its disposal. This, as well as the absence of an additional neurotransmitter or other related chemical to mark and store the overload event, will lead to this physiological response. The standard theory of psychology refers to this process as gapping. This process of gapping has a few consequences. One consequence is the inability for the brain to access the additional resources needed in order to continue using intelligence and the processes related to intelligent activation. For this reason, when the gap is crossed, the other versions of intelligence such as orthogonal thinking or horizontal thinking are no longer expressly accessible. Instead, the vagus nerve and nervous system does all that it can in order to conserve energy. This means reducing the brain's capacity to use up that energy in order to reallocate that energy for survival response. This leads to the phenomenon of post-intelligent processing. This type of phenomenon is not directly related to the R scale. In fact, the phenomenon is measured on its own scale, which is referred to as the Z scale. Previously, we mentioned the Z0 scale or scale of pre-intelligent impulse. We have discussed the entirety of the R scale or the scale of intelligence and can move forward to the Z scale or the scale of post-intelligent impulse. Please join me in the next segment where we will discuss the various aspects of the Z scale. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment we discussed supersocial communication in absolute thinking and the physical response of gapping. So far we have covered vertical thinking on the Z0 scale as well as the entire R scale. From here we can discuss the Z scale or the scale of post-intelligent impulse. In this segment we will present the main communication types within the Z scale. From there we can look more closely at each one. Once the gap is reached on the R scale, the physiological response that is experienced there will change the capacity and type of thinking that is available. From the gap, the thinking and capacity will move from the R scale onto the Z scale, since the process of gapping theoretically disallows the use of intelligent, additive processing in favor of vertical thinking. There are several types of communication within vertical thinking on the Z scale. These include rolling communication, metaphysical communication, impulsive communication, compulsive communication, and compulsive-impulsive communication. Each of these types measures a certain dynamic within vertical thinking. In intelligence, the main dynamic is that of additive or high-energy processing. On the Z scale, the dynamic concerns low-energy or impulsive processing. The gap from the R scale occurs between positive 117 and 118 characteristics of communication. The gap results in an inversion of several characteristics. From the gap, the constructive range of communication begins at negative 180 characteristics on the Z scale. As discussed previously, the R scale concerns the characteristics from positive 1 to positive 117. After gapping, the Z scale begins at negative 180 characteristics. This point of negative 180 characteristics can be referred to as the landing zone after the gap, also referred to as the turnaround. At the turnaround, a person will use one of two main processes. These processes have been discussed previously as the intelligent or impulsive processing, similar to a directive or a deferral. These processes essentially associate the communication being experienced with a high-energy or a low-energy process. On the Z scale, though, the tendency is to continue low-energy processing since the capacity for high-energy processing has become limited. For this reason, the constructive range of communication on the Z scale should begin at negative 180 and move in a more negative direction to negative 181, negative 182, negative 183 and so on. The constructive range from the turnaround in a negative direction is negative 180 to negative 197. This range contains several communication types. The normal operating range or most constructive version of communication on the Z scale is the range from negative 180 to negative 185. This range is referred to as metaphysical communication. At the processing of the interval of negative 185, there is another observable physiological response referred to as the vertical gap. This change corresponds to the end of metaphysical communication and the beginning of impulsive communication, with the impulsive communication ranging from negative 185 to negative 191 characteristics. From 191 to 197, the range is referred to as compulsive communication. From negative 197 and beyond, the range is referred to as compulsive impulsive communication. These processes from negative 180 to negative 197 are the low energy, impulsive processes in the negative direction. When at the turnaround negative 180, though, there is the capacity to apply high-energy associations with a communication cycle. This pseudo-additive or partial high-energy process would move the cycle characteristic in a positive direction, meaning that the communication would move from negative 180 to negative 178, negative 176 and so on. There is a capacity to continue this process all the way through to the horizontal gap at negative 118 characteristics. This range of communication from negative 180 to negative 118 is referred to as rolling communication. These are the main constructive thinking types associated with the Z scale, which, in total, range from negative 118 to negative 197 with the turnaround of negative 180 somewhere in between. Again, the types are rolling communication from negative 118 to negative 180, the turnaround at negative 180, metaphysical communication from negative 180 to negative 185, impulsive communication from negative 185 to negative 191, compulsive communication from negative 191 to negative 197, and compulsive impulse from negative 197 and beyond. The Z scale or scale-off post-intelligent impulse measures and keeps track of each of these communication types. In the following segments we can discuss each of the communication types in more detail. Please join me in the next segment to discuss metaphysical communication on the Z scale. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment we introduced the Z scale as well as the communication types on the Z scale. In this segment we will begin exploring each of the communication types in more detail, beginning with metaphysical communication. When the processing related to the Z scale becomes active, that activation begins at negative 180 characteristics of communication. The dynamics of vertical thinking will apply to each characteristic at this level in order for a person to experience each cycle of communication. Previously we discussed vertical thinking concerning the Z0 scale. At that time we introduced the idea of the requirement of an impulse, a subtraction and a compression in order to complete a communication cycle. On the Z scale, each negative step has the same requirement. That is, in order to move from negative 180 characteristics to negative 181 characteristics, a person must experience an impulse, a subtraction and a compression. In this sense, the completed cycle of communication will increase the negative number of communication cycles being processed at any given time, with negative 180 being the starting point of that process. In metaphysical communication on the scale of post-intelligent impulse, though, the impulse that leads to the beginning of that communication cycle is not expressly required to begin from some sort of environmental factor. In post-intelligent impulse, the impulse can be caused by an internal factor such as the processing of a hormone, neurotransmitter, emotion, or likewise. In an abnormal sense, things like medications, drugs, alcohol, medication and other substances can lead to the requirement that an impulse be experienced. Those circumstances will be discussed later. For now, We can assume that some sort of natural physiological factor will cause the impulse. This is the physical part of communication which has its origins from within the brain or body. The other possibility is that the impulse begins a communication cycle as a response to the environment or as a response to another person's prompt for communication. In that way, the cycle of communication will be caused by some external factor, relating to the meta aspect. These together, the external and internal factors which lead to the initiation of a communication cycle, are the basis for the term metaphysical in metaphysical communication. These factors can lead to either the beginning, middle or end of a communication cycle as well as the constructive experience of each. From there, the information must be sorted within that communication cycle in a way that adds up to the interval ratio unit of communication. If either of those fail, though, a non-standard process can be expected, which will be discussed later. In a constructive sense, the communication that a person experiences is based on a combination of these internal and external factors. These occur until the communication is completed or is perpetuated until some other factor ends the communication. Each cycle related to the situation will result in an additional negative characteristic of communication, the first cycle moving from -180 to -181. Each of these cycles contains an interval ratio unit amount of information or an interval unit subtraction. If the cycle requires more consideration or an additional cycle, the communication would move from -181 to -182 with an interval ratio unit of information. With an additional cycle, the communication would move from -182 to -183 and so on. Constructively, the range of metaphysical communication extends from -180 to -185 with the processing of -185 characteristics leading to the vertical gap. The vertical gap is a physiological response similar to the phenomenon at the top of the R scale. Within the constructive range, though, there is the capacity to apply up to 4.5 cycles of communication back-to-back without experiencing this physiological phenomenon. These 4.5 processes work together to address the factors associated with the communication. Beyond these 4.5 processes, though, the experience of the vertical gap can be expected. Before that, though, any meaningful initiation of communication can occur within the 4.5 cycle range. After the gap, the capacity changes, namely, the capacity for the compression or express storage of these processes becomes quite difficult. The communication after the vertical gap is regularly expected to fail in terms of successfully compressing the information related to the communication cycles. For this reason, the communication is no longer considered metaphysical at that point and is instead referred to as impulsive communication. Please join me in the next segment to discuss more about impulsive communication on the Z scale. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment we introduced metaphysical communication on the Z scale. In this segment we will discuss impulsive communication as well as compulsive and compulsive-impulsive communication on the Z scale. In metaphysical communication, the constructive operating range was described as -180 characteristics to -185 characteristics. According to the standard theory of psychology, at -185 characteristics, the capacity for communication changes from metaphysical communication to impulsive communication. As discussed previously, any given cycle of communication on the Z scale has a requirement of containing an impulse, a subtraction and a compression, the information contained in each adding up to a standard interval ratio unit of information. Once impulsive communication is reached, though, there is a tendency for the process of compression to consistently fail. This absence or failure to compress this information is the basis for the term impulsive communication, as the cycle of communication is no longer expressly based on the compression or the completion of a communication cycle. The advancement from -185 to -186, from -186 to -187 and so on become more closely related to the impulse associated with the communication cycle. For that reason, the impulse becomes the focal point of the cycle of communication, the range being referred to as impulsive communication. In impulsive communication, the magnitude of impulse is the focal point of the communication. This cycle can continue from -185 to -191 characteristics with a total of about 7 communication cycles. When looking a little bit deeper into Standard Theory 1, we'll find that these processes are more closely equated to about 3.5 processes with 1 complexity. That is somewhat expected as Standard Theory defines the capacity of communication on the scale of impulse to be about 4.5 cycles. The complexity or unknown in impulsive communication is related to the lack of a true compression of the communication cycle. The idea of complexity as well as the magnitude of impulse can be discussed later. For now, the importance of the range of communication for impulsive communication is the experience of these impulsive, partial cycles at -185 to -191. At the point of -191 cycles, the amount of information being processed forced the loss of true subtraction. This type of impulse-only processing is referred to as compulsive communication. At this point, the cycle of communication is impulse-only. For that reason, the focal point of the cycle is not impulse compared to subtraction but rather the impulse compared to the external factor or stimulation or whichever source that is related to the prompting of the communication. This can be another person, some environmental factor or other situation. That is, the experience of impulse without subtraction and without true compression is the main process in that cycle in compulsive communication. Since there is only impulse, the evaluation of the situation is compared to the magnitude of impulse associated with it. The term compulsive communication refers to the comparison of the communication cycle with the impulse being experienced, especially when that impulse-only cycle is being communicated between individuals or between groups and individuals or between groups. Beyond -191 cycles of communication, the capacity for experiencing impulse internally is no longer an option since the amount of negative processing has exceeded the normal amount about 3 times over. In reaching that level of negative processing, the capacity for compression, subtraction and internal impulse have all been maxed out. At -197 characteristics and beyond, there is only the capacity for complex communication. This complexity can be denoted by an imaginary number or a complex number. This acts as a placeholder for an unknown magnitude of information related to that communication cycle. This process can also be referenced by thinking of an entire unit plus 1, or as an entire capacity plus some amount of complex processing. That complex amount of processing is completely dependent on the interactions between the individual, the environment, the situation, the previous context of the interaction as well as any other factor being considered within that specific cycle of communication. For these reasons, the communication is nearly always non-standard in a way that requires some amount of subjective interpretation of the complexity being experienced. For that reason, the amount of information can be somewhat difficult to quantify. Beyond that, though, any amount of information that could be used in that cycle of communication can be referenced using a placeholder, i.e. the complex number. In compulsive impulse, there is the max amount of negative activation as well as the complex amount of information being considered in that communication cycle. This experience of complex information is the true limit of constructive communication, as the processing of any additional information would not only be almost completely subjective but is certainly associated with some other non-standard factor such as medication, substances, alcohol, injury, overstimulation, etc. In terms of the normal capacity of the Z scale, the negative limit can be considered to be -197 cycles of communication. Even though the idea of complexity and unknown magnitude of any process, whether complex impulse, complex subtraction or complex compression is required to explain compulsive impulse, the other applications of this can be discussed at a later time. For now, we will continue to the final constructive version of communication on the Z scale. That type of communication is a factor related to high-energy processing on the scale of impulse, which is referred to as rolling communication. Please join me in the next segment to discuss rolling communication on the Z scale. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments we introduced the Z scale and its low-energy communication types, including metaphysical communication, impulsive communication, compulsive communication and compulsive impulse. In this segment we will discuss rolling communication, which is considered a positive communication type on the Z scale. On the Z scale, the constructive starting point can be referred to as the turnaround at -180 characteristics. The positive direction from the turnaround would trend from -180 to -178 to -176 and so on. The tendency to move in a positive direction concerns the range from the turnaround all the way back to the point of the gap from an inverted direction for a total range of -180 to -118, about 62 characteristics total in the positive direction. As discussed previously, the horizontal gap is experienced between the processing of the positive 117th and 118th characteristics. When moving from the gap to the turnaround and then moving from -180 characteristics in the positive direction, the capacity for accessing these positive, high-energy processes is limited. Since the horizontal gap theoretically reduces the access to the high-energy structures, the low energy of the Z scale will access only a portion of the high-energy compressions. The process of impulse from the Z scale can still partially access the high-energy storage related to the scale of intelligence. This partial capacity is related to the consequence of the gapping process as well as the proportion of information contained in an interval ratio subtraction versus the information in a high-energy characteristic. These specific ratios can be discussed later. For now, we will assume that the low-energy impulse only activates about 2/3 of the information that should be contained in a complete high-energy process. For this reason, when communication through rolling communication, there seems to be no true ending point or no true compression of those communication cycles. For this reason, the tendency in rolling communication is to activate some amount of information in the positive direction followed by another activation, then another and then another. Each time this happens, one may feel as if the complete point or the entire version of the compression has not been activated or has not been completely communicated. This is the reason for the name rolling communication, as the cycles continue rolling over into one another. These partial activations can be referred to as pseudo-additive. These pseudo-additive processes in rolling communication are similar to the characteristics of the R scale as well as the subtractions in the negative direction of the Z scale. It is important to mention that, even though this pseudo-additive process deals with a non-standard amount of information, this type of communication can be considered constructive in some sense. As mentioned previously, most cycles of communication can be considered constructive or destructive by determining whether the purpose is to communicate more information or to increase the amount of information being communicated. Inversely, the communication is destructive if the amount of information being communicated is decreased or the understanding is decreased. In rolling communication, if the purpose is constructive, the sum of each of the rolling cycles will terminate in a process referred to as an initiative. In a destructive sense, the termination of these processes can be referred to as a derogative. These are comparable to the directive and deferral of supersocial communication. At this point we have covered the entirety of the Z scale. We discussed the horizontal gap which leads to post-intelligent processing on the Z scale. We also discussed the result of that process which begins at -180 characteristics, also known as the turnaround. From there, we moved in the negative direction to negative communication types. Those are metaphysical, impulsive, compulsive and compulsive-impulsive communications. We also started from the turnaround and moved in the positive direction in rolling communication. With those, the entire Z scale has been covered. Please join me in the next segment as we review and summarize the Standard Behavioral Index. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments we introduced some main ideas about the standard theory of psychology and discussed the Standard Behavioral Index, including the R scale and Z scale. In this segment we will review the Standard Behavioral Index as well as some of the dynamics associated with each thinking and communication type. To begin, we discussed vertical thinking on the Z0 scale, which is the general process of using impulse, subtraction and compression in order to recognize and learn about an environment. These processes contribute completing one complete cycle of communication. According to the standard theory of psychology, there is a standard interval ratio amount of information in each of these cycles of communication. The completion of a single cycle of communication is measured by the Z0 scale. These completed cycles can be referred to as subtractions. After an individual experiences a sufficient number of these cycles of communication, there is a chance that they will gain the capacity for high-energy or intelligent processing. In intelligent or high-energy processing, the subtractions from the Z0 scale are combined in order to create unique ideas. These ideas are comprised of a specific number of these interval ratio units of low-energy subtractions. These low-energy units are combined in order to form a high-energy unit, which is also processed at a proportional interval ratio unit. This high-energy unit can be referred to as a characteristic. The total capacity for the high-energy characteristics are measured on the R scale. The R scale concerns three main thinking types. These are known as horizontal, orthogonal, and absolute thinking. Within each of these are communication types. In horizontal thinking there are three communication types. These are self, intimate and social communication. Self-communication concerns one-to-self only from 1 to 3 characteristics. Intimate communication concerns one-on-one only from 4 to 6 characteristics. Social communication concerns one-to-many from 9 to 7 characteristics. In orthogonal thinking there is one main communication type known as shared communication. Shared communication is an indirect form of communication and concerns characteristics 10 through 17. These characteristics are achieved through a composition and decomposition of the 1 through 9 characteristics of horizontal thinking. One side of communication is handled by the aversive party and the other side is handled by the subversive party. In absolute thinking there is one communication type known as supersocial communication. This is a process of sorting information for the purpose of solving a simultaneous relationship between three identities. The range of supersocial communication deals with three main nodes of communication at 27, 54 and 117 characteristics of communication. By moving beyond this range, the physiological experiencing of gapping occurs. This gap reduces the amount of energy available for intelligence. The consequence of this process is the changeover to post-intelligent processing. This post-intelligent processing is measured by the Z scale, or the scale of post-intelligent impulse. The processes related to intelligence are still partially accessible from the Z scale, hence the reference to post-intelligence. The constructive starting point of the Z scale is negative 180 characteristics, and is also referred to as the turnaround. From the turnaround, one can move in a positive or a negative direction. In the negative direction, the Z scale measures metaphysical communication from negative 180 characteristics to negative 185 characteristics, impulsive communication from negative 185 to negative 191 characteristics, compulsive communication from negative 191 to negative 197 characteristics, and finally impulsive communication from negative 197 plus some amount of complexity. In the positive direction, from the turnaround, rolling communication concerns negative 180 characteristics all the way to negative 118 characteristics. Each of these steps are active in an incomplete way, with each step referred to as a pseudo-additive process. Each of the aforementioned processes are the pieces that work together to form the standard behavioral index. Each of these can be considered in order to describe essentially every aspect of human behavior and psychology. Up to this point, we have only discussed the standardized versions of each of these scales. In order to answer questions about what happens when something goes wrong, we must view each of the communication types in an inverse or destructive way. Please join me in the next segment as we begin to look at the abnormal or non-standard manifestations of human behavior. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments, we discussed the unilateral, constructive view of the standard behavioral index. In those segments, we discussed the view of standard activation from highest to lowest energy in a constructive sense. There we discussed what happens when things occur in a generally predictable way. In the following segments, we will begin to discuss the non-standard or abnormal manifestations of these activations. Following that, we can discuss some specific situations such as diagnostics, mental illness, medication and substance abuse, and so on. For now, we will begin with the scale of intelligence. We will discuss the abnormal manifestation of each characteristic. This can be thought of as a deactivation of each of those cycles of communication from high to low energy rather than activation from low to high energy. From there, we can discuss the abnormal versions of the Z0 scale as well as those abnormal manifestations on the Z scale. Beyond that, there are three important abnormal scales to discuss. There is the abnormal thinking type of cyclic thinking, which contains several of its own communication types. From there, the scale of female hormonal compulsive impulse, also known as the V scale, can be discussed. From there, the true scale of intelligent derangement, known as the D scale, can be discussed. To begin, we will take a look at horizontal thinking. In the previous segments, we discussed the communication types contained within horizontal thinking on the R scale. These communication types are silent, intimate and social communication. We will begin at characteristic 6, which is the intimate orientation, and move backwards from there. In a constructive sense, the intimate orientation or sixth characteristic is considered to be the limit of intelligent activation. This max level of activation is not generally sustainable and, at some point, will face disruption by some means. There are several possibilities as to what the actual disruption will be, from physical disruption to an environmental problem or the problem with the other person being communicated with, and so forth. Any of these disruptions will lead to a deactivation of the characteristic. In a destructive sense, each of these deactivations are related to a specific phenomenon or behavior. During the deactivation of this max level of processing, the expected outcome is referred to as recursion. This process of recursion is related to the abnormal cyclic thinking type, which can be discussed in more detail later. However, the deactivation of the sixth characteristic will result in the process of recursion, which is related to a repeated attempt to achieve the overload event associated with the max activation. In a constructive sense, the processing of the sixth characteristic should lead to too much information being processed, which becomes associated with the release of a neurotransmitter. Once this max activation begins to deactivate, the cycle of communication will need to be either terminated or resolved. When the cycle is not terminated and, instead, an attempt is made to resolve the communication, a process of repeatedly offering information or communication related to the cycle will be displayed. This is the repeated and failed attempt to apply enough information to the communication cycle in order to satisfy the interval ratio unit required to properly complete that cycle. This is the attempt to continue the dynamic process of constructive intimacy without adequate activation. During the deactivation of the sixth characteristic, the process of recursion or repeated attempt at resolution will be observed. From there, we can move to the deactivation of the fifth characteristic. In a constructive sense, the fifth characteristic or intimate identity is related to the interpretation of the overload event. The pattern of that event interpretation is considered to be the personality. During the deactivation of that fifth characteristic, the tendency is to display one of several processes. The umbrella term for these processes is referred to as reversion. That is, the process of reverting back to a lower level of activation. Within reversion, there are a few possibilities. One observable behavior is that of deceit. Deceit is the willful and known transmission of false information or information unrelated to the dynamic process of intimacy. This is one way to prompt the other communicating party that the experience of constructive intimacy is no longer possible. This allows the level of communication to revert to a lower level of activation. Another observable behavior is that of a deferral. In the deferral process, the tendency is to refuse to offer communication in a dynamic sensum. This can also be the communication of a low-energy process or a lower-energy process. This is done to move away from the dynamic process of intimacy in a way that allows a reversion to a lower level of activation, especially as a response to someone's intimate orientation. From there we can move to the deactivation of the fourth characteristic. In the deactivation of the fourth characteristic we can observe another form of reversion. In a constructive sense, the fourth characteristic is related to securing the amount of excess energy needed for high-energy reciprocation. The deactivation of this can differ depending on the tendency of the communication being experienced. In one sense, the fourth characteristic can be deactivated prior to communication, or the fourth characteristic might not have been achieved in a way that allows the dynamic communication with another person. During a prompt for communication, a deferral or deceit might be displayed. If the deactivation happens prior to the dynamic process, is referred to as anxiety might be displayed. In this process of anxiety, an interpretation of the overall situation, known as an intimate personality, might be displayed rather than the confirmation of the capacity for communication. This is essentially the display of a negative intimate identity instead of the display of a positive intimate interaction. This overt display of identity during the lack of activation of the fourth characteristic is the definition of intimate anxiety. There is also a chance that the person will be aware of the lack of activation, in which case the process of deferral is more likely to be displayed. The process of deferral as well as the process of anxiety are both related to the deactivation or lack of activation of the fourth characteristic. In this segment we presented the idea of abnormal or non-standard processes and discussed those abnormal processes in relation to intimate communication in the R scale. Please join me in the next segment where we will continue to discuss abnormal or non-standard processes in intelligence. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment we introduced the idea of non-standard or abnormal processes on the Standard Behavior Index. We began with the abnormal processes in horizontal thinking, specifically intimate communication. In this segment we will continue with non-standard processes on the R scale, including social and silent communication. In a constructive sense, the third characteristic in silent communication concerns self-orientation. This is the process of understanding self-interaction to the point of prioritizing communication to tend towards another person, or otherwise prioritizing communication to tend toward the self. This is also referred to as the free will junction. In the deactivation or lack of activation of the third characteristic, a process referred to as compensatory behavior can be observed. In this process, some sort of observable physical behavior will be utilized by the individual in order to complete the cycle of communication, or in order to account for the lack of activation or lack of proper self-understanding. The process of compensatory behavior is considered by the standard theory of psychology to be the junction that relates all non-standard behavior to intelligent communication. To reach a little bit further, the display of behavior on the Z scale can, in most cases, be related to the deactivation or lack of activation of the free will junction. In theory, since the activation for the communication of this characteristic is not adequate, the individual will compensate in an attempt to complete that cycle of communication in a way that mimics increased activation. This type of behavior can be observed as body language, violence, anger, internal impulse, and other forms of physical response. Any of these are related to the attempt for the body to compensate for the incomplete cycle of communication or activation experienced by the mind. From here we can move to the second characteristic known constructively as self-interaction. In a deactivation of this characteristic, a process known as intimacy dysfunction can occur. Intimacy dysfunction is a general term that refers to the failure to process or complete any communication cycle that is meant to be experienced in a one-on-one fashion. For that reason, most of the communication that would be expressed during the deactivation of this characteristic can be either unrelated to the specific communication cycle, referential to a social or external construct rather than an intimate or intelligent one, or could be an inverted or distorted version of what a person might truly wish to communicate with the other. The lack of that level of activation as well as the inhibitory process that would not have been satisfied would usually prevent an adequate or appropriate amount of information to be communicated. This is especially true when considered the amount of interval ratio information required to complete a dynamically intimate or self-orientable cycle of communication. For these reasons, any attempt at intelligence during the deactivation of the second characteristic can be considered to result in a non-standard or abnormal termination. Next, we can consider the deactivation or lack of activation of the first characteristic in horizontal thinking. In a constructive sense, the first characteristic of communication is related to the self-identity. This is a process that refers to the unique combination of impulsive processes in order to make a new, high-energy idea. When this process is deactivated or is not achieved during a communication cycle, the process known as dissociation will occur. In this process, the environment or another external factor such as a relationship, circumstance, social construct or otherwise will take precedence in processing. The interpretation of the environment will prevail over the unique high-energy association related to the self-identity. In the process of dissociation, the lack of identity will drive the communication. This process of dissociation can lead to various related issues, as disjunction will partially disqualify the communication from silent and intimate communication. When following the termination of the cycle of communication related to the dissociation, there are a few possibilities. This can get confusing as the tendency or preference is related to the individual, the environment as well as the circumstance related to the dissociation. One path is the changeover to a different communication type. This can be the experience of a subversive communication cycle in shared communication. The changeover can also be to a social cycle of communication by way of the willful separation from individuality in order to continue to the communication in a constructive sense instead of leaving the communication unresolved. Another related option is the tendency to separate from individuality in order to communicate in an indirect sense as an aversive party in supersocial communication. In this scenario, the separation of individuality is also completed willingly. Another scenario is the forceful deactivation of the self-identity, which can lead to a social problem known as shared identity disorder. In that sense, a person is forced or required to communicate unwilling based on the lack of their own identity, which can be discussed later. Another option yet is the changeover to the scale of impulse, which would favor a low-energy version of communication in order to complete constructive communication cycles in a constructive sense. In any of these scenarios, the issue would stem from the lack of a compatible, constructive self-identity. So far we have discussed the non-standard processes in intimate and silent communication. In intimate communication, the sixth characteristic of deactivation refers to a process known as recursion, the fifth related to reversion, deceit and deferral, the fourth related to reversion and anxiety. In silent communication, the deactivation of the third characteristic is related to compensatory behavior, the deactivation of the second related to intimacy dysfunction, and the first related to dissociation or identity loss. Please join me in the next segment where we will present the deactivation of social characteristics. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments we discussed the abnormal processes related to intimate and silent communication in horizontal thinking on the R scale. In this segment we will continue exploring the abnormal version of horizontal thinking by discussing social communication. In a constructive sense, the ninth characteristic of communication in social communication is related to a social identity. In social identity, a person will separate themselves from their own individuality in order to communicate something about a larger construct. During the abnormal manifestation of this process, a person will deal with a phenomenon known as shared identity disorder. This process is relevant to shared communication as well. For now we will discuss the social version of this process. In shared identity disorder, a person may relate either their self or intimate identity to the social construct that they separate in order to refer to. In this sense, the social identity of the individual will become more prevalent than their self or intimate identity. For that reason, the information related to their separation of identity can take priority over self-communication and one-on-one communication. Since this occurs within the separation of identity, this process can be considered to be related to dissociation, especially as a preference for communication following dissociation. For those reasons, the lack of social identity or comparing the social identity to others can lead to an abnormal or non-standard termination of a communication cycle. The importance of these processes are also related to shared communication and absolute communication. To continue, the constructive version of the eighth characteristic is considered a social orientation. This is the reference to a specific subset of information within the social construct or within the social identity. In the deactivation or abnormal display of the social orientation, some part of that subset will replace another version of communication. In a general sense, this is a prelude to the condition known as addiction. According to the standard theory of psychology, addiction is defined as the reliance on external factors to take the place of any other characteristic or pattern of communication. In this sense, the experience of an external factor, whether that be an item, idea, organization, abstract or otherwise, can be considered constructive. However, once the experience of this factor consistently or repeatedly replaces another version of communication, whether in intelligence or impulse, that process is considered addiction. This is the replacement of another characteristic with the external factor. Next, we can discuss the deactivation of the seventh characteristic, which is constructively known as a social interaction. The process of social interaction relies on the interpretation of a social orientation by assigning either a low-energy or high-energy process to that orientation. In the deactivation or non-standard display of this characteristic, though, the tendency is to relate the outcome of that social factor another version of communication, especially the relation to an intimate process. This pattern of associating the interpretation of a social interaction as the product of a one-on-one process is known as social intimacy. In this process, one will relate the process of interpreting a social situation to another version of communication. This process falsely uses the high or low energy interpretation of an external factor to take the place of some other form of communication. This is especially true of other types of horizontal thinking. So far, we have discussed the abnormal versions of horizontal thinking from intimate communication, silent communication and social communication. Please join me in the next segment where we will continue to explore the abnormal version of the R scale in orthogonal thinking and shared communication. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments we presented the abnormal versions of the characteristics in horizontal thinking. In this segment we will explore the abnormal versions of orthogonal thinking and shared communication. In a constructive sense, most of orthogonal thinking and shared communication concern two parties who communicate varying amounts of interval ratio units of information indirectly. One of those parties is considered to be the aversive party. Constructively, the aversive party makes a decision to separate themselves from individuality in order to interpret some type of social or external construct. This is done for the benefit of the subversive part, who will consider that information in an attempt to draw a conclusion about some part of horizontal thinking. In an abnormal sense, though, most problems can be related to the dynamic between the subversive and aversive parties. One of the most prevalent problems in this type of relation is the phenomenon of shared identity disorder. In this phenomenon, the indirect relationship between the parties will take precedence over each party's individual processing. That is, a disproportional reliance on the opposite party will be displayed even during prompting for other types of communication and other thinking types. This abnormal dynamic leads to a reliance on either party in a way that leads to a tendency to display either a subversive stance or aversive stance in decision-making and communication. Another abnormal version of this relationship is referred to as forced identity disorder. In this sense, either of the parties will choose some version of deactivation in order to obtain a specific outcome of communication. In the abnormal aversive sense, the aversive party will knowingly transmit false or unrelated information in order to see the subversive party obtain some type of process, characteristic or decision that is more closely related to the desire of the aversive party rather than the true interpretation of that information by the subversive party. This is done to align the identity that the aversive party assumes with the identity that the aversive party wants the subversive party to assume. In this sense, the aversive party forces the identity upon the subversive party rather than the subversive party being able to conclude their own interpretation of the communication cycle. In the abnormal subversive sense, a person can tend to choose to give their decision-making process to another. In this process, the subversive party will prefer to put off their own communication cycles in favor of an aversive party completing or interpreting some part of that communication cycle for them. This process of subversive identity disorder can be the preference over other types of communication. There are additional dynamics that are related to shared communication, such as orthogonal impulse and false identity, which will be discussed at a later point. For now, we can move to absolute thinking and supersocial communication. In a constructive sense, the process of absolute thinking concerns a process of sorting identities and from there solving the relationship between multiple identities in a way that can be handled by some other thinking type. In an abnormal sense, the consequence of an abnormal or non-standard sorting process in supersocial communication can lead to problems in other communication and thinking types. This happens when an abnormal sorting takes place. This can be caused by an irregular impulse or by a false identity. The processes related to these abnormal sortings are referred to as conditional relationships, disinterests and pseudo-directives. In a conditional relationship, the sorting of identities is more or less fixed to give a specific result regardless of what is being sorted. In this sense, a relationship between identities will always be considered to be high energy or low energy at every instance of the presentation of those identities. This sorting is closely related to identities which are thought to be unrelated or incompatible, especially when those identities have been solved by a different thinking type. Because of this sort of predisposition, when those identities are sorted in supersocial communication, the previous result will always force the sort to be related to that previous result. This leads to a predetermined condition between those identities rather than an organic sorting during their active presentation. This can lead to a certain identity always being related to a high-energy process regardless of what it's being compared to. A related version of this process is referred to as a disinterest. The phenomenon of disinterest of an identity forced that identity to consistently be associated with a low-energy association regardless of the way that the identity is presented. This is more closely related to the identity being associated with an irregular impulse, which can be discussed later. By placing emphasis on the associated impulse, though, the presentation of that identity or the relationship related to that identity will almost always be correlated to a low energy or unfavorable or non-standard process. For this reason, the interpretation of that specific identity is more likely to be deferred at multiple levels of communication. This is especially true when the identity is not organically evaluated prior to that decision of disinterest being made. Another abnormal process in supersocial communication is referred to as a pseudo-directive. In a conditional relationship, the tendency is to apply a certain sorting to a specific identity, especially in a high-energy sense without respect to the true sorting process. In disinterest, the tendency is to assign a single or multiple low-energy statuses to an identity regardless of the organic sorting process. In a pseudo-directive, the process of assigning a sorting value to an identity will be mixed. That is, at some levels of sorting, an identity can be thought of as high-energy while, at others, that process can be thought of as low-energy. This combination of high and low sorting for a single identity is referred to as a pseudo-directive. There is the equivocal term of pseudo-deferral, however, for the most part, either are sufficient when describing the combination of high and low energy processes for a single identity. Next, the processes of personification and depersonification can be discussed. In the previous examples, the abnormal or non-standard process related to the sorting. In personification, the abnormal process is related to the identity. The process of personification relates to adding an additional identity to a different thinking type. When considering supersocial communication in a constructive sense, the first step in high to low activation is referred to as the supersocial identity. This process relates at least three identities in a way that requires some kind of sorting. This sorting leads to the comparison of the remaining identities to be completed in some other way, preferably via a different thinking type. In the abnormal process of personification, a set of identities which is already solvable using a different thinking type is associated with an additional identity in order to force the sorting of those identities. This process of false association leads to an unnecessary sorting of identities which would otherwise be unrelated. The process of intentionally associating additional identities in order to force supersocial communication is referred to as personification. A further abnormal version of this process is referred to as depersonification. In the process of depersonification brings an additional set of identities which forces an otherwise solvable identity to be re-evaluated. This causes an unnecessary sorting in order to force the previously solved identities to become associated with a falsely high energy or falsely low energy process. This is somewhat related to the abnormal processes of some other thinking types being perpetuated by forcing an extra solve on those abnormal processes, especially in forced identity disorder, disinterest, deferrals, conditional relationship and derogatives as way to further communicate the abnormal interpretation of those processes. This additional solve is meant to reinforce the abnormal nature of the communication cycle or associated identities. There is an additional abnormal in supersocial processing that has already been explained. That process is referred to as gapping. That process is a physiological response to the overactivation or overcomparison of identities. This occurs at 118 characteristics of communication and leads to the inversion of intelligent characteristics as well as their processing. This phenomenon of gapping is important in other abnormal versions of communication, namely compulsive impulse and when considering the dark zone. Those processes can be discussed later. Please join me in the next segment where we will continue our discussion by exploring the abnormal processes of the Z scale. Welcome to the Standard Theory of Psychology. In the previous segments we discussed the abnormal processes related to the R scale and intelligence. In this segment we will move from the R scale over to the Z scale. On the Z scale, in a constructive sense, each cycle of communication, whether in a positive or negative direction, is defined by the process of vertical thinking. In vertical thinking, the requirement of attaining a complete cycle of communication using impulse, subtraction and compression contributes to the overall interval ratio unit of communication. In an abnormal sense, any of these processes can be experienced in an irregular fashion. When this happens, the contribution of each of these parts do not add up to the interval ratio unit. Instead, there is some irregular amount of information that is attained overall. Since there are several factors that can lead to these abnormal processes, each of the irregular processes can be referred to as a complex version of that process. This provides the idea of a complex impulse, a complex subtraction and a complex compression. In a constructive sense, a compression is the terminal point of any cycle of communication, and, assuming any other part of that communication cycle is complex, the compression can be expected to be complex as well. For that reason, complex compression as it relates to a complete communication cycle can be referred to as simply a complexity. In that way, we can correlate any number of irregular cycles as that number of complexities rather than stating complex impulse followed by compression, complex subtraction followed by complex compression and complex compression without subtraction and without impulse. In order to describe those three abnormal cycles of communication, we can refer to those as three complex cycles of communication or as three complexities. In this way we can refer to any abnormal cycle of communication on the R scale, from -118 all the way to 197 and beyond, by identifying the communication type and from there identifying the number of complexities related to that communication type. This can be achieved using the Z scale along with the idea of complexities. This can also be achieved using the Z range scale. On the Z range scale, all communication begins at the turnaround of -180 characteristics. Once there, each cycle of communication is evaluated for the impulse, subtraction and compression. Depending on the context, the number of cycles of communication may vary. In an abnormal sense, some of those cycles will contain unknown or complex processes. Anytime an unknown process is observed to be communicated, that specific process can be denoted using a complex number. From there we can determine the magnitude of communication being displayed. From there, we can determine how many total characteristics are complex. From there, we can compare the total cycles of communications to the number of complexities. From there, we can decompose the magnitude of communication in order to determine where the true complexity originates. Previously, when discussing shared communication, the idea of decomposing communication was done by removing social identities or 9 characteristics from the resulting characteristic. On the Z range scale, the number of social identities that are removed are equivalent to the number of communication cycles. In this way we are able to decompose the constructive aspects of those cycles with a remainder of the abnormal processes. This gives a much closer approximation to the unresolved cycle of communication and provides some information about what has caused the irregularity in the first place in terms of what is missing or what is extra. By using either the Z scale with complexities or the Z range scale, we can observe some magnitude of communication. By comparing that magnitude of subtractions to the processes of the R scale, we can get some information about where the intelligent version of that communication might have occurred. This allows us to associate these processes with a high-energy characteristic. For this reason, the Z range scale and Z scale with complexity allow us to account for the processes that contribute to incomplete cycles of communication. Beyond standard theory, the study of the relation between the R scale and Z scale is explored in a study called STEM psychology. The STEM in STEM psychology is short for scientifically and statistically transmutable supersocial and metaphysical psychology. This study allows for some generalizations of the patterns of activation seen on the R scale and the Z scale. These are things such as personality types, emotions, IQ intervals, S-values in spherical derangement, complex magnitudes, complex distancing and complex characteristics. Each of these can be discussed at a later point. For now, though, we can continue to the final thinking type, which measures the amount of irregularity in communication. Please join me in the next segment where we will discuss cyclic thinking and its communication types. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments we have discussed the abnormal views of each of the thinking and communication types on the R scale and the Z scale. In this segment we will continue with abnormal processes by looking into the abnormal thinking type, which is referred to as cyclic thinking. In a constructive sense, a cycle of communication is meant to contain a beginning, middle and end in a way that adds up to a specific interval ratio unit of information. Once this interval ratio unit has been achieved, The communication cycle can be compressed and stored within the structures of the brain. In an abnormal or irregular sense, this interval ratio unit will not be achieved or will be exceeded. Once this happens or until this is resolved, the resulting communication can be related to a process of cycling thinking. In cyclic thinking, the irregular amount of information will cause a continuing issue when trying to achieve a communication cycle containing a standard unit of information. The extent to which this occurs is measured by the communication type within cyclic thinking. The first communication type within cyclic thinking is referred to as circular thinking. In circular thinking, the tendency is for the abnormal amount of information to be recognized and resolved by way of deferring or ignoring the cycle by recognizing the abnormal amount of information. From there, the next cycle of communication can easily be completed in a standard fashion. This type of circular thinking is related to a process called a disruption. The disruption will easily be recognized and can be ignored in favor of continuing to experience constructive communication in subsequent cycles. The main attribute of the disruption and of circular thinking is the temporary effect on constructive communication. The second communication type in cyclic thinking is referred to as ovular thinking. In ovular thinking, some amount of the irregular information associated with either a single or multiple communication cycles becomes compressed in a way that leads to an abnormal amount of information being utilized during subsequent cycles of communication. In ovular communication, the dissolution of the previous cycle of communication will influence and change the subsequent cycles of communication on a consistent basis. This is especially true when communicating with specific people related to those communication cycles. Ovular communication is related to a process known as a derangement. The experience of a derangement is caused by an unresolved disruption or a continuing disruption or a disruption that has not been adequately deferred. One of the main features of the derangement is its effect on subsequent cycles of communication, especially when communication with others who were involved with that communication. It is important to note that a derangement is more likely to affect a small number of communication cycles and are less likely to affect communication with new individuals and groups or individuals and groups who are not closely related to the communication that caused the derangement. Also, there is a high likelihood that the derangement will resolve itself over time or over some number of meaningful communication cycles. When these problems do not resolve themselves, they become more closely related to elliptical communication, which is the third type of cyclic thinking. In elliptical communication, the tendency is to base all communication cycles on the continued derangement regardless of situation or who is being communicated with. During this step of cyclic thinking, all subsequent communication is affected by whichever process has been left unresolved. Another possibility is the lack of awareness of the derangement or lack of awareness of irregular or non-standard communication. In that scenario, the individual who displays elliptical communication may be unaware that their processing is non-standard or irregular. One main attribute of this communication is the display of these irregular intervals regardless of who the individual communicates with. This leads to abnormal processing whether or not the subsequent communication has anything to do with the other parties communicating or not. This is most closely related to a process that can be considered to be a traditional mental illness. At this phase, most of those individuals dealing with those irregular cycles of communication can be counseled or made aware of what they are causing or what they are going through. From there, the realization or actualization of their condition could potentially lead to the mitigation of their problems. At this phase, the individual would likely be open to suggestions or be willing to work on whatever their issue is found to be. If not, their condition could be described by the fourth step of cyclic thinking, which is referred to as incongruent communication. In incongruent communication, the amount of irregular communication cycles has exceeded a specific threshold of related informational processing. At that threshold, the proportion of irregular processes far exceed the proportion of constructive cycles of communication. After breaking that threshold, the individual must face the problem of no longer being able to communicate constructively. At that point, the individual will no longer organically attempt to communicate in most situations. There is a likelihood that every cycle of communication will be presented, though derangement, with the consideration of constructive communication being reserved for others who display similar derangement. This relates the entire process of dynamic reciprocation to derangement and relates any other process to the ultimatum that the communication will fail. When dealing with incongruent communication, two main problems can present themselves. One is the problem of impulse, in which the amount of impulse associated with the related derangements exceeds the total amount of capacity of communication. With this problem, the interpretation of each cycle of communication can become a mixed bag, with one cycle being related to a positive impulse, the next with a negative impulse, the one after that negative, after that a positive impulse, and so on, especially when dealing with a single context or single situation. This overload causes the purpose of the communication to be poorly understood and poorly communicated. For that reason, the communication can be considered incongruent. The second problem relates to the amount of subtraction associated with each communication cycle. In that sense, a single or repeated impulse can relate to an irregular or unknown amount of information in a way that relates that impulse to an unknown or poorly compressed situation. With this problem, the interpretation of the situation, whether positive or negative, is poorly defined in relation to the context. In this sense, the magnitude of the context far exceeds the impulse related to the context. Similarly, the impulse might, in actuality, be unrelated to the context, which leads to the meaning of the situation being related to impulse only with a somewhat ambiguous correlation to anything else. Each of these, the first referred to as impulsive incongruence and the second as compulsive incongruence, are some main issues in the fourth step of cyclic thinking. These are both related to a process that can be referred to as a true disease. At the disease phase, the main attribute is a person's unwillingness to accept counseling or treatment regardless of what is offered to them. Their refusal to improve their condition is one of the main factors in determining the difference between the illness and disease phase. Each of these steps in cyclic thinking can be applied to the severity of diagnostics in traditional mental illness. These can be applied to traditional diagnoses by identifying whether the condition is related to a disruption, a derangement, an illness, or a true disease. The methodology of applying to standard theory can be discussed later. We have presented the abnormal thinking type referred to as cyclic thinking and its communication types, which are circular, ovular, elliptical, and incongruent thinking. Please join me in the next segments where we will discuss some special cases in standard theory, including the V-scale and D-scale. Welcome to standard theory. In the previous segments we discussed the standard and non-standard versions of thinking on the R-scale and the Z-scale, including the non-standard thinking type of cyclic thinking. In this segment we will discuss a special scale that measures a specific phenomenon. This scale is referred to as the V-scale, which is short for the Venus scale. This scale measures a phenomenon experienced by women in terms of the biological female gender. The experiences measured by the V-scale happen somewhat involuntarily and are related to the physiology of the woman. As mentioned previously, there is a certain limit to constructive processing when considering either the R-scale or the Z-scale. Previously, the communication types of the Z-scale were presented as rolling communication, metaphysical communication, impulsive communication, compulsive communication, and compulsive-impulsive communication. According to the standard theory of psychology, there are factors which push the level of negative activation beyond compulsive impulse. This type of processing is referred to as hormone-induced compulsive-impulsive impulse. This process is related to the amount of hormones that a woman will process during the experience of vertical thinking. Theoretically, the continued stimulation leads to the experience of a complex amount of information. Previously, the idea was presented that a non-standard or unknown amount of information can be considered to be complex. This can apply to a complex amount of impulse, a complex amount of subtraction, or a complex amount of compression. When these factors are unknown, their magnitude can be represented by a complex number of some magnitude. In hormone-induced compulsive impulse, though, each cycle of communication becomes defined by this complex amount of information. For that reason, each cycle of communication experienced on the V-scale can be referred to as a complex cycle of communication. In these complex cycles, essentially each aspect of the communication cycle can become based on an unknown amount of processing. Furthermore, the capacity for storing, communicating, or recalling these complex cycles of communication can become limited based on the extreme level of negative activation. For these reasons, the experience of these cycles of communication are influenced by the interpretation of that level of the V-scale. As a side note, which may or may not be discussed in the future, one method that can be used to mark the experience of each of these levels on the V-scale is the application of an olfactory process. According to the standard theory of psychology, the process of olfaction provides a replacement for an impulse in vertical thinking. This process of olfaction, or the sense of smell, is correlated to an impulse that is about 4 times stronger than the impulse of external or other internal stimulation. For now, we will not discuss the dynamics of olfaction specifically. We can identify the idea that the complex cycles of communication experienced by women can easily become associated with scent in an attempt to create a meaningful storage or method for recall of the complex cycle of communication. The V-scale accounts for each of these cycles as a factor or as a level of communication. In all, there are 6 levels or 6 factors to be considered on the scale. The numbering of these factors begins at 0, with the 0 factor being somewhat trivial. The processing of this factor is somewhat redundant as it relates specifically to the experience of being alive in terms of true vitality. Even still, The personification of an individual even after their passing or as the general idea or representation of that person can be enough to consider their potential to influence communication in a complex way. For this reason, this zero factor is considered somewhat redundant and hence referenced as the zero factor. The first factor of the V-scale concerns 4 complexities. In the first complex cycle of communication on the V-scale, women will experience a pattern comprised of 4 dimensions or directions of movement. The experience of these dimensions are related to the theoretical subtraction or environmental pattern associated with those complexities. In a general sense, these 4 complexities are experienced as some sort of pattern. The features related to that pattern can be experienced as shape, color, sound, or some abstract. The defining aspect of the first factor of the V-scale are the relationship between these 4 complexities. Sometimes the complexity can present itself as groups of 1 versus 3, 2 versus 2, 1 versus 1 versus 2 and 3 versus 1 in some cases. Defining and sorting these can be somewhat difficult since each are entirely based on some unknown amount of information that must be interpreted in order to be understood in a meaningful sense. For this reason, the first factor on the V-scale can be considered as a complex identity experienced by women. The experience of these patterns can be related to the number of complexities or number of directions being considered during the negative activation. The second factor of the V-scale concerns 7 of these complexities of communication. This factor serves as a comparative version of the complex experience. Women who experience this level of communication can use these 7 complexities to compare themselves to one another as well as comparing themselves to men. In a woman-to-woman sense, there is the capacity for a woman to recognize that other women deal with the complexities associated with the second factors as well as other factors on the V-scale. For that reason, the second factor can be considered to be the place where women can consider each other as equal in comparison to each other based on the equal experience of that capacity for complex communication. In some sense, the view of platonic versus romantic partners can be correlated to the interaction at the second factor of the Z-scale when thinking of the opposite sex. This allows women to group the complexities displayed by others in a way that correlates to a larger or smaller number of complexities. These can be experienced as another person displaying 1, 4 or 6 complexities or, in a larger magnitude, 8 or 10 complexities. The comparison of others in this way allows women to sort their overall interpretation of another person based on their comparison of these complex experiences in a somewhat instinctual way. From there, women are able to make decisions of the nature of their relationship with those other individuals based on the instinctual comparison in relation to their own experience of those 7 complexities. Furthermore, this can be achieved by using the patterns associated with those experiences in groups of complexities. For example, 3 complexities plus 4 could be considered with each of those complexities being a shape, color, scent or other experienced. These groups, whether the 3 complexity group or 4 complexity group, can be used to compare the complexity of another to the complexity of their own experience. That is, one 4 group versus another's 4 group, one 3 group versus another's 4 group, one's 4 group versus another's 3 group and so on. This second factor allows those types of comparisons to determine how the relationship between individuals can be sorted in a meaningful way. For these reasons, the second factor of the V-scale can be referred to as a complex interaction. The third factor of the V-scale can be considered to be complex orientation. When explaining this factor to non-women, the easiest reference would be to associate the level of 11 complexities with a terminal view of the environment. At the third factor of the V-scale, there are 11 directions of movement to consider. These directions are, theoretically, out of range of any sort of interaction or influence on the part of the women. For that reason, it serves as a sort of terminal view of things that is really meant to be observed only. There are other phenomena that can be described in terms of interaction with others, especially men, which will be mentioned shortly. The experience of this third factor concerning 11 complexities is an experience that can be attained between women. However, the view from that point is not easily interpreted without experiencing it firsthand. Moreover, the nature of things communicated as a result of that view are more easily explained by women. There are ways to re-experience those complexities once a woman has been able to regain their capacity for other types of communication or thinking. In that sense, though, the experience of that number of complexities can seem far-fetched or somewhat incredulous, since the amount of information along with the sorts of interactions and relationships contains so much complexity. Even still, the patterns associated with those complexities can be experienced as groups of complexities similarly to the first and second factors. In the third factor, severe groups can comprise the totality of the 11 directions, such as 4 plus 7, 7 plus 4, 8 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 and so on. These are theoretically based on some sort of environmental interpretations as well as the interactions of those environments. The view of these complexities in the third factor of the V-scale are referred to as the complex orientation. Beyond the terminal view of the third factor is the fourth factor, referred to as the big one. The big one is not limited to a specific number of complexities. Instead, there are a range of complex interactions that can be experienced between the terminal views of women. In the fourth factor, the range of complexities exists between 14 and 17 directions. These directions are experienced as 14 versus 15 and as 17 versus 16. These complexities are heavily related to the identity of the individual woman on the R scale as well as the Z scale. The magnitude of that total processing outside of the V scale along with other factors can be a heavy influence on the determination of the number of direction experienced on the fourth factor. This fourth factor allows for complex interactions and complex experiences that are somewhat unique based on the interpretation of the woman herself compared to her environment and the other women in that environment. This level of complexity is based on the extreme directions experienced in this state of processing. This experiential type of communication can be referred to as the complex range of communication. Beyond that, though, there is a capacity to experience continued stimulation beyond the complex range. In this sense, the fifth factor, the V-scale, contains the view of the complex range from some additional angle or some additional direction. In a general sense, the inherent physiological processes of a woman should not lead to additional complexity. However, the exposure to certain factors, especially medication, drugs, alcohol, injury, overstimulation and others, can lead to the experience of the fifth factor of the V-scale. At this fifth factor, the view of the complex range is heavily influenced by the subjective experience of the factor that leads to that additional amount of stimulation beyond the normal range. The effect of the medication or drug or injury or other factor leading to this experience can change the subjective experience of that level of complexity. The number of directions of the complex range are experienced at 19, 20, and 22 complexities. Another dynamic to mention within each of these factors is the deferral of or consideration of additional directions of movement within each of the ranges. For those reasons, the numbers of directions in each can be modified based on the experience of each woman on an individual basis. For example, in the first factor of the V-scale, a woman can defer or ignore one of the directions, leaving a total of 3 directions of consideration rather than 4. Similarly, on the third factor, a woman can theoretically consider an additional direction within or between the groups being experienced, leading to a total of 12 directions being considered. These deferral and considerations are the woman's way of expressing something about their experience or influence on the situation being interpreted. These allow a sort of unique interpretation of each of the factors described on the V-scale. To review, each level of the V-scale is related to a specific amount of complex information. Each of these factors is related to a specific number of directions of movement being experienced by the woman. Standard theory identifies a total of 6 levels, also referred to as factors numbered 0 to 5. The 0 factor concerns 1 complexity. The first factor concerns 4 complexities, the second concerning 7, the third concerning 11, the fourth concerning a range between 14 and 17 complexities, and the fifth concerning more than 17, namely 19 through 22 complexities. Each of these are based on the meaningful interpretation of an unknown or irregular amount of stimulation. In the next segment, we will explore another case of complex communication and its manifestation on the scale of intelligence. Please join me in the next segment where we will discuss the dark zone, which is measured by the D scale. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment, we discussed a special case of the Standard Behavioral Index by introducing the V scale, which accounts for the phenomenon of hormone-induced compulsive impulse in women. In this segment, we will continue to discuss complex communication and its manifestation in intelligent processing on the R scale. This type of complex communication on the R scale is a special case that is measured by the D scale, which is short for the dark scale. The dark scale measures an otherwise unused capacity in intelligence. The dark scale is related to the processing of some irregular amount of information in intelligence. This can be considered to be based on complexity, especially as a result of the experience of complex impulse. There are other factors which relate to the experience of communication in the dark zone, such as medication, drugs, injury, and others. The main feature of the dark zone is the processing of an irregular amount of information that is related to some other meaningful or discernible process. This includes incomplete cycles of communication, partial interpretations of new information, subtractions and characteristics which are unresolved or falsely associated, and disinterests. According to the standard theory of psychology, the experience of communication on the dark scale is related to a failed attempt at sorting information relating to the solving of a relationship between identities. The idea of three-party shared intimacy was discussed in a previous segment. In three-party shared intimacy, the number of factors being considered are more than the normal capacity for comparison in constructive communication. For this reason, an additional sorting is required to complete the regular, interval ratio unit of communication required for each cycle. In the dark zone, there is theoretically some factor which contributes to an amount of total information which is either more or less than the interval ratio unit. This can be related expressly to a complexity at any level of communication. One example is the change in impulse caused by drug or medication use. Theoretically, the experience of processing a drug or medication can change the magnitude of impulse from an amount that contributes a proportional amount of activation to the overall cycle of communication. That is, the drug or medication can either decrease or increase the perceived amount of impulse in a specific cycle of communication. This can change the impulse from something like 1/2 of a unit to 1/4 or 1/3 of a unit. For this reason, the result of the total cycle of communication would not be equal to the standard interval ratio unit. In this scenario, the standard interval ratio unit would not be attainable without either modifying the subtraction or modifying the compression of that experience. Under that circumstance, the cycle of communication can still theoretically be compressed in some way. However, the total amount of information can easily become mismatched from the interval ratio unit required for complete construction compression of information. For this reason, the structures handling the compressions may or may not store that information effectively. Since that irregularity may not be completely compressed, the processing of that either additional or missing information must be taken a step further. The need for this additional processing is inherently handled by the dark zone. On the D scale, there is a capacity to handle these sortings without completely compressing the cycle of communication. This can be referred to as a dark cycle of communication. According to the standard theory of psychology, the number of dark cycles on the D scale is related to the capacity for processing impulse in any constructive sense. This has been referred to in a previous segment as about 4.5 processes of impulse. The phenomenon of sorting these dark processes can also be performed in a compulsive sense. After the initial capacity of 4 impulses are used to sort dark information, the comparison of environmental factors, especially the dark cycles of another person, can contribute to further sorting of the dark cycle. Each sorting relates to a cycle of communication within the dark zone. As an extension of the R scale, the dark zone concerns characteristics 25 through 18. These 8 steps are divided into impulsive darkness from 25 to 22 characteristics and compulsive darkness from 21 to 18. These processes are comprised of some amount of complex impulse as well as an unknown amount of information, each set of which can be referred to as a dark characteristic. Each attempt at sorting correlates to a single dark cycle with a maximum amount of 8 dark characteristics plus some amount of complexity in terms of communicating, resolving or creating a terminal view of the dark characteristics. The unresolved nature of each of these can also be parallel to the experience of cyclic thinking. The first dark characteristic can be considered to be an expression of circular communication, the second an expression of ovular communication, the third elliptical communication, the fourth incongruent communication. From there, the compulsive version of the scale can be thought to be comprised of compositions of the comparisons of one's dark characteristics to another's dark characteristics. The process of comparing the magnitude of each dark characteristic to another's is a parallel to compulsive communication. One danger of processing in the dark zone is its similarity to intelligence. The magnitude of information being processed is in a dark characteristic comparable to a constructive characteristic of communication in the sense that it can be comprised of some sort of high-energy amount of information or high-energy impulse. For this reason, without the consideration of the unresolved complexity within that dark characteristic, the communication of a dark characteristic can easily take the place of a constructive cycle of intelligent communication. In this sense, the person utilizing the dark cycle of communication can continue to use unresolved communication in place of true intelligence. Solving the problem of that exploit is related to a supersocial conditional relationship. This can only be done by recognizing the complexity of the dark characteristic and considering that amount of complexity when communicating with the individual who prefers dark characteristics over true intelligence. The predisposed consideration of this complexity leads to a conditional relationship when communicating, as the additional complexity requires sorting prior to completing communication. To address the recognition of these processes, 2 distinct phenomena can be observed as the result of dark communication which takes the place of intelligence. These are referred to by standard theory as the processes of coercion and exploitation. In coercion, a person will force another to display some amount of dark characteristic via an unrelated or unsolved cycle of communication. This is done to create some amount of confusion or unresolved processing in true intelligence. From there, the person using dark characteristics will compare the amount of unknown to their own dark processing. In this way, the coercer will correlate the cycle of communication to the unknown or incomplete processing of the intelligent part. The exploitation: the individual using a dark cycle will prefer to overstimulate or use an overly ambiguous type of information in order to confuse the intelligent party in creating some sort of interpretation of an otherwise meaningless or complex cycle of communicatone. From there, the person using the dark characteristic can form their own idea related either to the intelligent individual or the overall situation based on the interpretation offered by the intelligent individual. The process of coercion can be parallel to the process of impulsive communication, while the process of exploitation can be parallel to compulsive communication. So far we have explored several aspects of the standard theory of psychology, including the constructive and destructive versions of the R scale and the Z scale, as well as the special cases of the V scale and the D scale. Now that complex communication has been presented, we will revisit some concepts related to STEM psychology. Please join me in the next segment where we will revisit STEM psychology. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments we discussed some special scales of communication, including the V scale and the D scale. In this segment we will revisit the study of STEM psychology, which correlates the scale of impulse to the scale of intelligence. The study of STEM psychology allows the trends of communication between the R and Z scale to be observed and studied. These phenomena can be thought of as personality types. The types of personalities recognized by the standard theory of psychology are loosely based on the amount of baseline complexity used in each respective type. Previously, the capacity of impulse in any given cycle of communication was identified at 4.5 cycles. Each of these levels of impulse can be accompanied by some amount of complex information. For that reason, standard theory identifies 4+1 main personality types. The first type relies on zero complexity in the processing of intelligent information. This personality is referred to as a positive personality. In positive personality, the trend of communication of intelligence is expected to proceed from a low-energy processing to a high-energy processing, with the expectation of the individual that communication will tend to become more constructive. In positive personality, the expenditure of additional energy is the preference in order to complete the transmission of information or in order to complete reciprocable cycles of communications with others across varying types of thinking and communication. The tendency is for this type of communication to become more constructive, and time goes on with the tendency for communication to build up to the overload event experienced in intimate communication. The second personality type is based on a baseline of 1 complexity. This type of communication is not necessarily destructive in nature, but will likely tend to result in some amount of destructive cycle of communication by way of avoiding transmission of complete cycles of communication in favor of communicating some amount of complexity related to each cycle. This type of personality is referred to as negative personality, and the tendency is for the communication to become less constructive over time. Those with negative personalities expect that communication will fail based on the complexity associated with the negative personality. This in itself does not mean that a person with negative personality cannot maintain relationships or complete communication. Instead, the nature of relationship and communication of constructive cycles are reliant on the need for the baseline complexity related to the negative personality to be communicated to the other party as a way to complete a meaningful cycle of communication. In negative personality, the communication can be considered unresolved or pending until that complexity can be understood by the other party in communication. For that reason, some of the relationships maintained by those with negative personalities can become related to the shared experience that complexity or the recognition of the chaos and unknown that serves as the baseline for the capacity of communication, since the negative personality type is based on some amount of irregular or unknown processing. This tends to begin at maximum intelligent activation and decrease from there, with the meaning of that communication more heavily dependent on the deactivation or lack of overload rather than the build-up to overload. The third personality type is considered to be a dissociative personality. In this type of processing, there are 2 complexities. The first complexity is not necessarily a baseline factor. Instead, the complexity in a dissociative personality is associated with any prompt for communication. From there, the complexity becomes related to the type of thinking related to that prompt for communication. Functionally, the first complexity becomes the related to the thinking type, though to be appropriate for the prompt for communication. For this reason, the first complexity of the dissociative personality correlates to the lack of a discernible identity at some level of communication, namely silent or self-identity. From there, the second complexity is correlated to the trend of communication, whether destructive or constructive. This allows for the experience of a positively dissociative personality as well as a negatively dissociative personality. The trend at that point follows the patterning of positive or negative personality. The expectation at that point is to form or recognize a discernible identity between the parties of communication based on the positive or negative trend. That is, the expectation that the communication will lead to overload or will not lead to overload. The complexity of expected thinking type as well as the complexity for the experience of either positive or negative identity are the main features of the dissociative personality type. The fourth personality type is based on three complexities, each of which relate to thinking type, identity and resolution of communication. This type of personality is referred to as depersonalized personality type or lack of personality. In this personality type, the tendency is to avoid as much communication as possible as well as avoiding the resolution of the communication in order to prevent the compression or meaning related to the communicating in neither a positive nor negative way. In this sense, the expected tendency is to correlate the perceived outcome of communication, whether high or low energy, with the identity of the person prompting for communication rather than associated either with the individual experiencing depersonalized personality. In that sense, the expected outcome can be related to the process of personification or the association of an otherwise solvable relationship with an additional factor, in this case the additional factor being the association of the alternate party's identity with the outcome of the communication. This prevents the formation of relationships in a way that avoids trending towards or away from the overload event used to form and mark intimate personality. The formation of this personality in any sense is related to the standard theory of psychology's interpretation of intelligence in the form of an IQ interval. Please join me in the next segment as we explore the different types of IQ as defined by STEM psychology. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment we discussed personality types and their trends in terms of experiencing intimate identity. In this segment we will explore the related phenomenon of the measure of true intelligence or the intelligence quotient interval or IQ interval. According to the standard theory of psychology, the experience of true intelligence is based on the unique interpretation of the experiences had by the individual. The experience of these unique events can be correlated to an overload process in the brain which can be associated with either processing or lack of processing of a neurotransmitter. The understanding of the relationship between these processes of experience and interpretation of experience are considered the interpretation of true intelligence. That is, not only understanding the unique experiences that one experiences but also being able to understand and communicate the interpretation of each of those experiences in a meaningful way. The ratio of these processes is evaluated by a measure referred to as an IQ interval. The interval is an inverse measure as a larger IQ interval correlates to a lack of understanding or a lack of interpretation of unique experience. When using this measure, the larger the IQ interval, the larger the number of misunderstood or unsolved cycles of unique experience is perceived to be. In a very small or zero IQ interval, each unique experience is correlated to some amount of understanding as well as meaningful interpretation of each of those experiences. For this reason, the true understanding of unique and experience in an interpretable way is correlated to true intelligence. There is theoretically a way to achieve a negative IQ interval in a way that considers the outcome of unique experiences which have not expressly been experienced. That consideration gives some sort of interpretation of hypothetical experience within the range of passability of the individual. In this way, standard theory account for the result of predictable experience in a way that allows the outcome of each of those future experiences to be accounted for. This IQ interval is the measure that standard theory uses to account for true intelligence. This method can be applied to silent communication as well, with the measure of that interval existing between self-interaction and self-understanding rather than intimate identity and intimate orientation. The silent version of this interval can be referred to as a silent interval or SI. Each of these two intervals differ from the awareness of external factors or the experience of social orientation, items, ideas or constructs as the awareness of an item, concept or idea. This social awareness does not necessarily expressly relate to the unique interpretation of those constructs. For this reason, true intelligence is more closely related to the unique interpretation of experience rather than the exposure to information via social or shared communication. In order to measure that type of process, a measure of social IQ, social quotient or square, can be used. In social intelligence, the interval between the magnitude of a person's separation from individuality compared to the constructs that a person is able to experience within that separation gives the measure for the amount of social information that a person is aware of within a given construct. In order to standardize this process in a comparable sense, there may be a way to choose a specific level of separation per set of comparisons. For example, a social quotient in terms of a university test versus a social quotient in terms of a puzzle-solving test versus a general social quotient. These would standardize or fix the magnitude of separation of individuality or the magnitude of social identity in a way that would not rely on the individual but would rely on the subsets being tested. The amount awareness of the subsets would then be used to measure the quotient of social intelligence. Another quotient that can be explored using STEM psychology is the emotional quotient. We will take this opportunity to address the phenomenon of emotion as explained by the standard theory of psychology. In a previous segment, the dynamics of orthogonal thinking were discussed. In a constructive sense, that process is related to the indirect communication between an aversive and subversive of party. This is achieved by composing and decomposing the characteristics of communication experienced by each party. The process of emotion can be correlated to a complex composition when these parties communicate indirectly. In orthogonal thinking, the process of composition can be denoted by a plus sign. In emotional processing, the plus sign can be thought of as a complex process and becomes conditional on the perceived relationship between the aversive and subversive party. The result of that complex comparison between the aversive and subversive party is experienced as emotion. The emotions of happiness, sadness, anger, etc. are experienced as a result of that complex comparison. There is a strong correlation to the perceived capacity of the two parties to experience an equal amount of communication. Positive emotions can be equated to the experience of equatable amounts of communication. If that perceived capacity is not equivalent, then the experience of a negative emotion can be expected. These complex comparisons are the fundamental basis of the experience of human emotion. In the emotional quotient measured by STEM psychology, the quotient exists between the understanding of those experiential emotions as well as the resulting behavior from those complex processes. A smaller EQ interval would relate to an understanding of a larger range of emotion along with a lack of need for compensatory behavior in relation to each emotion. This correlates to the awareness and understanding of each of those emotions in a way that allows the compression and understanding of each without resorting to behavior to further explore the complex comparison. In a larger EQ interval, there would exist a large capacity for behavioral change related to any amount of emotion, whether the range of emotion is limited or not. The capacity for the change in behavior based on the experience of emotion would correlate to a higher EQ. When considering EQ, though, there is some room for interpretation of the functional range of the experience of emotion, as a zero EQ interval could be somewhat correlated to a lack of emotional response or lack of emotional experience. On the other end, an EQ interval that is too large could correlate to a behavioral issue or emotional disorder. For that reason, a standard operating range in a functional sense could be interpreted based on circumstance. In either sense, though, the measure of how a person responds to emotion can be accounted for based on the EQ described by the standard theory of psychology through STEM psychology. In this segment, we have discussed the silent interval, the intelligent IQ interval, the social quotient, and the emotional quotient. Please join me in the next segment where we will explore the comparable function in absolute thinking, also referred to as the science of organizations. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments, we have explored some ideas that can be addressed using STEM psychology, including personality types and IQ. In this segment, we will explore a concept known as the science of organizations by using STEM psychology to address absolute thinking. In a previous segment, one aspect of absolute thinking was presented as the dynamic of communication of many people between many people, or the communication of many to many. This type of communication can be used to sort the purposes of forming groups of individuals in order to facilitate some sort of phenomenon. This is referred to as the science of organization and can theoretically be applied to any group of individuals who work under a specific set of rules in order to achieve something. This applies to governments, schools, businesses, laws and the legal system, sports teams, and essentially any group of people working together to accomplish something. The easiest way to address the purpose of any organization is to determine the ways that an organization differs from a random group of people. In that way, the factors which bring the organization together in a way that sets it apart from the random group of people can essentially define the organization. In the previous segment discussing absolute thinking, there were two discrete processes presented. Those processes were sorting processes referred to as directives and deferrals. The aspects of an organization can be accounted for using those sorting processes known as directives and deferrals. In theory, the set of directives and deferrals that are preserved by an organization are the main aspects which give meaning to that organization when compared to a random group of people. In law, for example, the knowledge of what is considered a crime as well as the punishments can be considered directives that are preserved by the organization of individuals responsible for upholding those laws. In politics, The views of social aspects and policies that are preserved by those organizations would be the defining directives of each respective political party. In the case of a university, the lessons and concepts that are taught to students would be defined as the directives being preserved by those organizations. The directives being used to conduct the operations of the organizations could be considered the main factors which set that organization apart from any random group of people. To give a counterexample, a random group of people who had not learned certain concepts or had not preserved some type of knowledge would not likely be able to operate as something like a university until those directives had been learned and upheld by that random group. In terms of a business, even if a random group of people work together to sell something, their set of directives related to the aspects of business such as distribution, marketing or sales would not necessarily be used or preserved in a way that would allow that random group of people to not only continue to sell something but to allow other random individuals to join in on selling that thing in an organized or easily understood way. The preservation of those types of ideas in the form of a high-energy interpretation of a situation for the purpose of completing a goal or achieving something can be considered a fundamental process which separates a random group of individuals from an organization. However, the term of directive can become ambiguous when considering the multiple aspects of each of those organizations, especially when considering things that organizations do not preserve or do not practice. When discussing non-standard versions of absolute thinking, there was presented the idea of a pseudo-directive. In that sense, the interpretation of a single sorting process was considered to be inconsistent. That does apply to a single sorting instance, but, in terms of organizations, there can be certain sortings to be considered. In law, for example, there are circumstances which can be sorted based on factors related to the case which correlates to the defense of a crime or likewise. In this sense, the interpretation of one version of this sorting versus another could be interpreted to mean that the sorting is associated with a pseudo-directive. However, since the sorting could be considered part of a standardized set of information in terms of defense in this case, the complete set of directives when sorting as well as the correlated deferrals when sorting, so long as each are upheld consistently throughout the organization, can be referred to as a factum. The term factum is used to describe a specific set of factors being upheld by an organization, whether those are related to a directive or a deferral in terms of preserving a standardized process. In that sense, the set of laws that are upheld by the justice system can be considered a factum of the organization of the justice system. Similarly, the best practices of standard operating procedure of a business can be considered the factum that is upheld by that business. In this way, the meaningful aspects of an organization can be identified and attributed in a way that gives inherent meaning to the practices of each respective organization in a way that sets that organization apart from any random group of people. The dynamics offered by standard theory in terms of absolute thinking and supersocial communication can be used to account for those processes within and between organizations. Please join me in the next segment where we will continue exploring the uses of STEM psychology by readdressing complex communication and its role in diagnosing mental illness. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments we discussed some applications of STEM psychology. In this segment we will use the idea of complex communication in order to address the problems related to abnormal communication in terms of mental illness. Previously, the idea of a complex characteristic of communication was used to refer to an unknown or irregular amount of information being processed in a meaningful cycle of communicating. When considered a complex characteristic, the result of processing has the potential to become disruptive not only to the cycle of characteristic in which that abnormal amount of information is being processed but disruptive to subsequent cycles. Under this assumption, the influence of that complex process can become apparent throughout different types of communication in a way that can accounted for using the concept of a complex magnitude. In previous segments, the idea that specific levels of psychological activation or specific characteristics can be composed with one another was presented. This process can apply to complex characteristics as well. In this sense, the composition of each complex characteristic between any cycle in which it may occur can be added up to account for the total amount of irregularity contributed by complex process. This sum of irregularity can be referred to as a complex magnitude. This complex magnitude correlates to some amount or irregular chunk of the sum of the cycles of communication which it affects. The sum of irregularity caused by the unresolved complexity theoretically correlates to some amount of excess or some amount of missing information. When addressing that irregularity or non-standard amount of information, one action to take would be to resolve that irregularity in a way that allows each of those affected cycles of communication to once again become subdivisible by the standard interval ratio unit of communication. In order to address this complex magnitude, one can use some form of a complex set of information. This is done to create some complex construct in a way that equals the complex magnitude of irregularity. This depends entirely on the irregular being experienced by the individual. This complex construct can be composed of things like complex shapes, complex intervals, complex rotations, all while meeting the requirement that the person experiencing the irregularity be able to experience the complex construct in a way that interacts with the affected cycles of communication. In theory, the exposure to the complex construct should give a resolution to the cycles of communication affected by the irregularity. In order to achieve this process, the complex construct can be moved in some sort of complex direction, with one direction tending towards increased experience of the complex construct and the other tending towards decreased experience of that complex construct. A tendency towards the experience could be considered a positively complex directly, while a tendency away could be considered a negatively complex direction. Furthermore, the accountability of these irregularities can be measured in a way that is addressable in a vector space. At that point, the application of physics and its measurements can be used to organize the magnitudes of irregularities being experiences as well as the magnitudes of intelligence or impulse being experienced in a constructive sense. These can be organized based on the communication type thought to be affected or being observed. Using the measurements related to movement in terms of speed, velocity and acceleration, the magnitude of the complex magnitude can be addressed as well as adjusted based on the preference for increased or decreased compression of some sort of experience. The measurement of silent communication can be correlated to a value of speed. There can be considered to be an acceptable magnitude of speed related to the constructive experience of silent communication. In intimate communication, there is a correlatable magnitude of velocity as well as the direction that magnitude, each of those providing information about the complexity or congruency of that type of communication. In social communication, the magnitude and direction are related to the acceleration of that information from the physical origin of that information to the point of communication or interpretation of that information. Essentially, every other type of communication in intelligence and in impulse can be accounted for using a complex amount of deceleration or as a complex jerk with discontinuous amounts of sorting leading to a termination or complete deceleration of each process. The complete deceleration of those processes could be correlated to a resolved amount of communication and, from there, considered to be a scalar multiple the standard interval ratio amount of communication. In any unresolved or irregular process, though, the tendency of that complex deceleration or complex jerk would result in some amount of continued movement discernible by a continued movement in some amount of non-zero acceleration. This can trend in either a positive or negative direction, and, as the discontinuity of the complex deceleration would be related to the sum of the factors being measured, any non-zero result in the consideration of those factors would be equivalent to the complex magnitude of the irregular process. In mental illness, these discontinuous magnitudes can be directly related to the extent of the illness or disease process. Please join me in the next segment where we will discuss traditional mental illness from the standpoint of standard theory. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments we have discussed the use of STEM psychology to evaluate the trends in communication in intelligent and impulsive communication. In this segment we will discuss the interpretation of traditional mental illness from the standpoint of the standard theory of psychology. In a traditional sense, most diagnoses made in psychiatry and psychology by way of resources including the International Classification of Diseases, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Illness and the Diagnostic Dictionary are more or less based on the symptoms which are observed or presented by the patient. These symptoms, by the view of standard theory, are almost entirely related to the process of compensatory behavior. These observable behaviors can be considered to be the attempt to resolve some level or cycle of communication in a way that has influenced the overall status of the person's communication. The factors that influence the communication, whether expressly identifiable or not, can be attributed to some amount of complexity and, from there, can be solved rather quickly in terms of the location of that irregularity with respect to the standard behavioral index. In this way, the traditional mental illnesses can be reorganized based on the correlatable characteristic of communication being affected in each disease process. For example, the process of schizophrenia and its associated symptoms can be explained by a disruption, deactivation or lack of activation of the first characteristic of communication known as self-identity. The dynamics of the non-standard expression of self-identity in terms of the standard behavioral index correlate quite closely to the resulting behaviors and experience associated with schizophrenia and its manifestations including the complex impulse or subtraction and hallucination, external association with meaningful identity and disproportional self-care. Standard theory refers to this non-standard process as dissociation with the severity of dissociation correlatable to a specific amount of cyclic thinking. Bipolar disorder, in terms of the physical type, is closely correlated to a non-standard experience of the second characteristic known as the self-interaction. The expression of this characteristic in a non-standard sense is referred to as intimacy dysfunction or the repeated failure to communicate in a one-on-one fashion. The lack of self-interaction and the correlated level of cyclic thinking correspond very closely to the manifestations of physical-type bipolar disorder, including the depressive withdrawal from interaction as well as the manic frustration of continued communication failure and intimacy dysfunction. The non-standard activation of the third characteristic as well as the consideration of deactivation, lack of activation or prompt for communication during either lack of or deactivation can be correlated to several discernible conditions in the traditional sense. These include the processes of obsessive-compulsive disorder as an attempt to resolve the interval between self-interaction and self-orientation, the processes of attention deficit as the continued deactivation of the third characteristic during the prompt for communication, attention hyperactivity as the overactivation or the third characteristic with or without prompt for communication, as well as depression as the continued lack of adequate activation of the third characteristic without prompt for communication. Each of these traditional illness can be directly related to the non-standard experience of the free will interval. The non-standard activation of the fourth characteristic can be directly related to the process of depression, defined as disproportional interaction through avoiding or forcing that interaction, and anxiety, which is defined as the process of replacing intimate identity with intimate interaction. The fifth characteristic of communication is related to anxiety in a complex sense, as the disproportionate interpretation of a situation during a prompt for communication can be irregular enough to deactivate one or more characteristics based on stress. This process, if severe enough, can be directly related to either anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder. The abnormal experience of the sixth characteristic can be directly related to the traditional process of autism. Standard theory defines the basis of autism as a disproportional amount of processing related to the overload event experienced at the sixth characteristic. The overstimulation of this process as well as understimulation of this process can change the way that the experience of one-on-one communication as well high-energy processing in intelligence is handled in general. This can lead to the observed behaviors of those diagnosed with autism in terms of overly extended cycles of high-energy processing or otherwise overly extended lack of these processes in relation to observable behavior. Furthermore, the observational diagnosis of autism in terms of a nonspecific behavioral abnormality can be more closely attributed to either another non-standard process or as a result of three-party shared intimacy in sorting the true source of the abnormality by either the parent or practitioner. Using a correlation to the presentation or associated symptoms of traditional illness, a comparable process as organized by the Standard Behavioral Index can directly identify the root cause of the presentation. From there, using the concepts of STEM psychology can not only address the exact magnitude of that process but the complementary amount of treatment needed to correct that problem. This allows the direct consideration of each condition on an individual basis with a repeatable and completely objective measure. Please join me in the next segment as we continue to explore psychological phenomenon from the standpoint of standard theory. Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment we introduced the view of traditional mental illness from the standpoint of the standard theory of psychology. In this segment we will use the standpoint of standard theory to evaluate various psychological phenomena. We will discuss some topics that can be vulnerable to subjective interpretation when considering traditional views of psychology, including sex, money, gambling and addiction. To begin with, the topic of sex as well as its associated behaviors and non-standard manifestations are directly objectifiable using standard theory. The aspects of the physiological phenomenon of sex do not necessarily need to be discussed in detail here. However, the associated activations and behaviors related to sex are closely correlatable to the patterns observed on the behavioral index and arguably directly relatable. In terms of sex from an intelligent viewpoint, the pattern of arousal follows the pattern of horizontal thinking. With some interpretation, the goal or endpoint of sex can be considered to be some sort of stimulation leading to an overload event that can be associated with a physiological response. According to the standard theory of psychology, this pattern of stimulation leading to overload is directly correlatable to the process described by horizontal thinking. In sex, though, the marking of the overload event is theoretically associated with either oxytocin or some sort of hormone as a result of that overload event. For that reason, the types of behaviors and communications related to sex during a physiological status which provides excess resources can be related to intelligent activation, and for that reason that type of sexual experience can be considered as intelligent sex. This is comparable to the interaction between physical arousal by way of exposure to androgens or pheromones from a partner and the subsequent buildup of that response to an overload event. This is parallel to the requirement of adequate self-interaction needed to experience the dynamic exchange of achieved activation. The phenomenon of sexuality is also related to the interaction between the type of androgen, male or female related to physical activation in relation to the dynamic exchange of the partner, male or female, associated with the overload response. If a male individual, for example, experiences or associates both physical activation and dynamic overload with the exposure to a female and female androgens, that individual is considered straight in terms of their sexuality. When those circumstances of activation and overload change, the term regarding sexuality will change as well. The view of non-standard sexual practice such as fetish, kink or hang-up can also be described by the non-standard activation of the Standard Behavioral Index. To continue, the question of the psychology of money can be easily objectified. In short, the handling of money psychologically is directly related to the measure of social intimacy. This is related to the abnormal activation of the seventh characteristic, or the social interaction. The use of money becomes related to a high or low energy process related to an item or idea. A way to further clarify the psychological aspect of money is to recognize intelligent use of money in terms of psychological activation. In one sense, the money can be thought to have an intrinsic value. This value relies on the interpretation of an individual in a way that correlates to intelligent orientation or intelligent understanding. The magnitude of an experience in relation to the overload associated with that intelligent understanding, as well as the intelligent interpretation of that magnitude, is objectively related to the perceived value of a process. This dynamic is related to intimate cycles of communication. This is the intrinsic value associated with an experience in an intimate sense. Another way to view the psychological importance of money is the social view, which is related to the price of something. The price of an item is objectively the same regardless of who experiences that item. Furthermore, the price of an item can be determined in a way that is related to how many of something there is in terms of how common or how long it takes to obtain. These factors do not necessarily require any sort of interpretation other than the awareness of those things within an environment. For that reason, the price of something is objectifiable based solely on the existence and availability of that thing. In terms of commerce, though, the way to obtain that thing based on its availability requires some indirect form of communication. That indirect process is handled by the exchange of money, either as a trade for social construct or as a replacement for the dynamic related to intimate communication. In terms of social intimacy, the exchange of money at any rate which does not see the exact amount of price being exchanged for an exact amount of value will lead to some inconsistent interpretation of the social interaction related to that price. This can lead to the direct association of the dynamic of intimacy with some sort of social construct which, according to standard theory, is defined as social intimacy. Since most commerce has some margin of profit, an indirect measurement of money can be considered to be related to the amount of social intimacy experienced in relation to those exchanges. Gambling, though, while related to money, can be related to processes that are not directly related to money. The experience of gambling might involve money, but there is a chance that it might not. When considering gambling psychologically, the focus would be on the behavior associated with winning or losing while gambling. In short, the dynamic relates to the reward response associated with gambling, which can be parallel to the perceived removal of the inhibitory response, or as a way to experience some situation which leads to an overload event. In gambling, this leads to some amount of either stress relief or reward response. Money, though, can be gained through these versions of social intimacy by those hosting the gambling. To address another topic, the view of addiction as well as its unique dynamic can be viewed using previously mentioned concepts within standard theory. As presented in a previous segment, the disproportional experience of an item or social orientation is considered to be related to addiction. This is identified by the reliance on or preference to communicate through social orientations, especially when used as a replacement for another type of communication. From there, the amount of reliance on that factor can be measured using the dynamic of cyclic thinking. In addiction, any type of communication, including intelligence, emotion, impulse or compulse, can be channeled through an item regardless of its importance to a third party. This sort of language of redirecting psychological activation to external factors can be considered its own phenomenon as an inverted type of communication, as it depends almost exclusively on the availability of an item rather than the physiological status of that individual. This sort of externalization leads to the understanding of the communication to be interpreted based on external factors as well as the possibilities associated with the third-party experiences of those factors rather than the interpretation of communication with any other individual directly. These types of topics and their associated problems have been addressed and interpreted by other versions of psychology in varying ways. Many of these interpretations have some amount of ambiguity and subjectivity associated with them. This can be considered true since each interpretation can be considered to take its own path. Please join me in the next segment where we will discuss these interpretations based on the standpoint of the standard theory of psychology.